Do you remember the first time I think that I met you at work? I think you were presenting something, and then I think I went up to you after your presentation, and I was like, "You have a voice that's very similar to Ryan Reynolds and is very calming and soothing." Hey everyone, welcome to the eighth episode of the MGL. Today I have Christian Rodriguez, a hip hop dancer, an Asian American Pacific and Islander champion, and most impressively, in my humble opinion, a voice as smooth and soft as cocoa butter. He's also a Crunchyroll alum, and I'm really happy to have him on today's pod. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you, Mike, and leave it to you to be the hype man that I did not know I needed on this Monday. Thank you so much for having me. I remember vividly, and Mike, you don't know how many times I've told people that there are people in the world that think I sound like Ryan Reynolds. And I don't know if you know this, but there was another person at Crunchyroll who also said the same thing, separate from you. It was, it was one of our coworkers, and she said it, and I was like, "You're the second person at this company who has now told me that I sound like Ryan Reynolds." Yeah, but now there are people out in the world who also think the same because I've shared that old coworkers have thought I sound like him. And so what they do is they're like, "Wait, Christian, I want to test this." And then they close their eyes and they're like, "Can you say something?" It's so ridiculous. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't personally don't hear it, but I find it amusing when people do also hear it. And I think back to you and our coworker, Nanda. Yeah.
Was I the first one that ever had mentioned it to you, and then like everyone else kind of just made that connection afterwards?
It was most definitely you first. Yeah. And then it was our other coworker.
Yeah, I'll definitely take that credit.
Add it to your resume, my friend. You can do that if you want.
I think you should add it to your resume, and then that way it's a good icebreaker. Like, if you happen to, lead an icebreaker for any sort of event, right? You say my name is Christian Rodriguez, right? Like two truths and a lie, right? And then maybe that one is like the subjective, like on the cusp, or right? Like maybe it could be like, oh, I've been told my voice sounds like Ryan Reynolds, and that's a good truth and a lie, like uh, somewhere in between.
I like that idea. I think I have to couch it in some humility though, because I do not believe that I sound like him. Um, but sure, I think it is a fun conversation starter. Yeah, I like
I
that.
think so, but you just have to claim that other people have said so, right? And that's what makes it, a potential truth, right? Like other people have claimed.
I'll go ahead and test it, Mike, and then on the next episode we can follow up on how that went.
Sounds good. I want to really like kick off this pod with your love of dance, and how you got into it, and like where did it all really start?
Yeah. Well, I'm I'm Filipino American. I grew up in a very Filipino community, and my parents, of their generation of Filipinos, ballroom dancing and line dancing is a really big thing for them. And so I grew up going to these what they call jam sessions. Parents and other parents of my age would rent out a high school gym or community center, and they'd hire a DJ, usually someone also from the Filipino community, and they would play various types of music that would be a part of different ballroom forms or styles. So cha cha cha, salsa, waltz, hustle, disco, different line dance songs, your electric slides, and your all the sort, right? As a kid, I would go only because parents don't want to hire babysitters, right? So I'd sit on the side with the other kids, and I'd have my Game Boy or whatever video game that I had, and I would just play, and my parents would enjoy themselves. But I was just always curious about what what dancing was happening, and so I would observe, and then I would learn, and then I would eventually go out onto the floor and try things like the line dances, which were a group thing, or I would switch off with my dad or my uncle to partner with my aunts or my mom. And so that really for me was the foundation of dance, or kind of my entry into it. It was a familial thing. It was a community thing. It was cultural, really, for me. And that's where I just started to move, was kind of in that space, where I started to get into.
I think it's really interesting, right, that it came from like a, I guess, semi-formal background, right? Because, a lot of times, a lot of people, how they got into dance was watching, MTV, right? Or watching, music videos, right? And so I think that's interesting that it came from like, a family first, community oriented place. It's just a very different start. Well, I wouldn't say a very different, but it's a unique starting path, right? At least to your first exposure. Like your parents weren't like, you're gonna be a ballerina, right? Like, and we're gonna put you in a dance school, right? It wasn't necessarily like a those two different paths where I feel like it's either MTV or dance school specifically. So I just wanted to comment on that. That I thought that was a very unique starting position, at least for your initial love of dance.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not until this point did I think it was that unique, but maybe it's just because I saw other kids my age who were also there. Granted, I don't know who else credits their start to dance to, an older generation of Filipinos doing ballroom. But yeah, it just felt kind of like a common thing for kids my age in San Diego, California at that time. Post that, when I getting into choreography, I was in the 6th grade, and it was my older cousin's debutante ball. And so, if you're not familiar out there, within Latino culture, we have quinceañeras, right? And I guess in American culture, there's Sweet 16. And then Filipino culture, we have celebrating a young woman turning 18 years old and kind of entering their adulthood. And that's called a debut, or debutante. And there were a bunch of kind of performances that would come along with that. You'd perform in a court, a number of people learning some kind of routine. But I joined in to perform with my cousins. Our group name was the Cool Cousins, and we did a hip hop performance. And that was my first foray into choreography. My older cousin, who was a DJ, choreographed some moves, and we practiced with the celebrant, my older female cousin, Michelle, and I danced with my brother and two other cousins. We were all kind of all children of kind of a set of brothers and sisters within the family. And I at this point, I already had loved. I'd love to start moving already. There's a video out there on YouTube, and if you make me, Mike, I will share it with you. Yeah, I'm happy to. Uh, of me just being like, thinking I'm like the coolest kid on the block, knowing how to dance, and telling people like, you're early or you're late or you did the wrong step. And these are my cousins. But yeah, that was just kind of my first foray into choreography. But I don't know, it felt cool. It felt cool to do synchronized.
Right? Like, did you have people that you were like looking at? Like, how did you just pick up, right, on how to teach choreography? Was it just from, watching your family, being kind of in the ballroom and listening to how, those teachers would be like, I don't know, like, next step is one, two, three, or whatever, right? Like, give me a little bit of background in terms of, where you think that kind of came from, because I don't, it's hard for me to believe that just like it just happens like in an instant.
And it doesn't. Again, another familial thing. Like, actually, dance. It was not a classroom thing at all for me at the beginning. I had an aunt. She's maybe 12 or 15 years older than me. When she was in high school and I was in elementary school, or even younger than that, she would go out to raves or parties, and not raves as we know them today, as like your EDC or your, um, like nocturnal, but like a rave at like someone's house or a club, and where people would actually dance in the club. And this is where a lot of dances come from, is the club scene or the streets, right? But she'd come home and she would teach me moves that she learned or would do at the club. And so things that I learned when I was, I don't know, south of 10 were like the wave. Like I learned how to wave when I was a kid, or like box things, like kind of the beginning of like tutting or things like that. And I just thought it was so cool to manipulate your body in that way that I would practice for hours in front of my mirror in my room, just because I thought it was cool. And when there was a formal opportunity to do some of that for my family in front of people with cousins, I was, yeah, like let's do this. So that's what it was. And the only reason why, I mean, it's choreography is because it's set, right? Like choreography versus freestyle is like this move, we're saying it's at this particular time, at this particular part of the music, in this particular timing. So yeah, I mean, that's the only reason and kind of first foray into choreography is because we were choosing to prepare a routine rather than just kind of freestyling and going at it.
One of the things that I think is interesting, when you mentioned, you looked in the mirror, right, and you were practicing the moves, right? Because one of my other friends, who's also a dancer, I remember I was like in sixth grade or something like that, and he was a really, really good dancer, and I don't think he had necessarily taken any classes. And I asked him like, "Hey, how did you get so good at dancing?" Right, like because he would, you know, learn all of the moves from the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, Britney Spears, right? He was so good at it. He knew the choreography for it. And he just said, I recorded it on VHS, a TV, basically recorded that copy of the choreography on VHS and just watched it and practiced it for over 4 to 5 hours a day, right? Like, and I bring that up because it kind of reminds me of like the mirroring. We'll use the mirror kind of as an analogy. It's like you're looking, you see something, and then you repeat it back. In this case, it's your aunt, right, going to the club, right, and taking those dance moves and putting it together and then coming back and showing you, right? And that was like your version of, MTV, right, to a certain extent, or learning like a set of, dance moves from a choreographed set, or even if it wasn't choreographed, even if it was just linking it all together. I'm guessing it's like how she put it all together, and maybe it wasn't explained through words, but it was explained through common movements that you would see come together.
All of those things are true for me. Yeah. I don't know if I would say like me doing it in the mirror is the same as MTV, because I also did watch music videos, and especially finding Asian folks within music videos, dancers, like uh there's a one, if I think back to Missy Elliott's Work It video, and um there's a Asian, actually a Filipino girl, who dances next to Allison Stone in that music video, and I was like, whoa, like whose cousin is that? Like, and that was actually really big for me. I was like, oh, I really want to be in a music video. I remember telling my mom, one day I'm gonna be in a music video. I can hear myself saying that to her. She was like, yeah, cool, all right. I look back on it and I think today I've kind of been in music videos, or
She obviously didn't really believe you at that point.
it did feel like that. But I think, looking back on it, I think I have achieved something like that, if not more. And it's cool to think that that's happened.
I'm sure your mom is quite proud, right, of all the things that you probably accomplished, with your dance stuff, especially you sounds like you come from a dancing family, right, that really appreciates it, and probably all forms of the art form.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there aren't many other, I'll say, choreography dancers in my family, but they appreciate it. Yeah, they love watching the videos that I end up doing. My parents have been to a number of my shows that I've done, And it still continues to be a big thing within the Filipino community. Uh, of course, largely the Asian and Asian American community as well, but Filipinos, yeah, I'm so many of the big choreographers that I know and that I've looked up to for the longest time are do identify as Filipino, and that's it's been a big part of kind of my participation is to see myself in this art form and to feel comfortable, like I belong.
I do want to go back a little bit to a little bit beyond the choreography and kind of into I'm assuming dance like in high school and college, right? Like, you talked about learning and teaching choreography, to your cousins, and obviously that's a very kind of informal setting. But then talk to me about, dance in a much more structured, collaborative, and you could arguably say kind of competitive. And I use competitive in the loosest of terms, especially if you're trying to join a dance team, right? Like that's maybe the only or if you're joining a dance team, or if you're on a dance team competing against another dance team, right? Like that's kind of I think the two elements of competition to a degree. So talk to me a little bit about that, and how that went from informal family dance outings and get-togethers to more structured out or more structured dance types of formats.
Yeah, growing up in San Diego, there was a lot of dance. There were dance crews formed by people who were in high school. So some of my contemporaries were on dance teams before they made it kind of big and other bigger dance teams. But for me, it started out in high school, and the high school scene. Let's see if I can work my way back into history. Uh, a, a big reason why the Asian American community, particularly in California, got into dance is because uh, these dance street forms, were taken into an event called Filipino Cultural Nights that showed up at colleges, right? Um, and the it got traction. There were these groups of young Asian Americans, Filipinos who wanted to dance in college, and it picked up popularity, and then it traveled to different colleges, and that college scene then influenced the high school scene, and that was kind of my entry into more formal choreographic dancing. So I joined in high school a team called Direct Input out of Montgomery High School in San Diego, California. And it was kind of like an air band slash dance team. And if you're not familiar with the term air band, it's kind of like a dance team that puts on a dance performance, but it's themed to some kind of story. Think Cinderella, but through dance, or think Beauty and the Beast, but through dance, or Peter Pan, if you will. And that started to evolve. There were air band competitions in high school, but then people just wanted to dance to good music, and so dance teams would put together these different sets of different pieces of choreography to different songs, and you would perform that set for maybe your high school assembly, or it was a high school Filipino culture night, or just an exhibition in your high school cafeteria, which was my first performance with Direct Input. And so that's what it was. But there was kind of always a direct line to some kind of college event or people who were influenced by the college scene. So already in high school, I'm looking forward to what the collegiate scene can provide for me in terms of dancing. When I graduated high school, I had not been dancing for a while because the group uh, kind of fizzled out. The seniors graduated, but I really wanted to get into dance uh, again, and that's because I was going to a place. I was moving from Southern California to the Bay Area to go to school, and this is where no one knew me, and I could really define what I wanted to do. And that was my kind of break into formal collegiate dancing that was competitive.
I was gonna say, talk to me a little bit about, yeah, that collegiate experience and what it was like, right, to have to, let's say, compete, right, to join a dance team. And the reason why kind of I say this is because actually I tried to join a dance team, not intentionally. I went along, with someone as well, and I didn't have a dance background, and so she just wanted to do it for fun. But I realized how difficult it was to join a dance team, especially if you don't have a dance background. Like, it's not impossible. Like, there are people who have done it, but it is hard to, if you're not used to some sort of choreography, whether it's dance, martial arts, like what are the next steps? How do you memorize all the choreography in a short period of time, right? That's something where like I was not used to that pace. But yeah, I just want to get your thoughts as a dancer of like, what was your first experience like joining or trying out for a collegiate team, and how that kind of differed from high school a bit?
When I was young, in high school, I tried out or attempted to try out for one of the prominent dance studios youth teams. And so I had already had been through kind of an audition process, even though I'd never danced at a studio or I'd been a part of a formal team, and had gone through the process of dancing, performing, and then being rejected. So I was familiar with the process going in to college. But and I think much is the case for many kind of collegiate dance teams at that time, which is around 2010 and into now, where you have to learn a piece of choreography or two, and then you go into a round where you have to do it in groups, and the judges watch you, and maybe you get called back to perform the choreography again. And in some cases, the dance team cares about what kind of person you are as well, so there might be an interview. I think for me, I was so jazzed to to get into the scene. I knew what it was like. I saw dancers around San Diego who were doing it in high school, and I so badly wanted that to be me, that I tried really hard. So I joined Main Stacks at UC Berkeley in 2010, and their audition setup was you would learn the choreography first one day, and then there would be a performance day, maybe a week or a few days after that, and you would have a chance to link up with a group and practice the choreography, and even have some creative freedom yourself to make some changes, add formations, and then even choreograph a piece on your own. Um, and so I was like, well, I treated this like a project. Like, I have to get this done because this is something I super want to do. But I was primed for it, right? Like, I had an expectation of what I needed to do and what was expected of me. I think if I were to go into it not being a dancer, absolutely, it's super hard. I mean, even as a dancer, there's so much pressure and you feel people watching you. But for someone who doesn't have that background, it's like, well, shoot, like this is really, really hard. To just learn choreography alone, I think is difficult, even for a seasoned dancer.
Yeah, because for me, it was okay, they teach you one move, right? You do it, right? It's kind of like Simon Says, but it's a really long game of like Simon Says slash, actually, I would say it's more like Bop It, but it's just like a really extended, longer version of that. It's like you play the sound once, you repeat the sound, right? Or then they'll just keep doing it for 10, 15, 20, more moves, and it's like you're expected to layer on top and remember every single thing. And I think that was the hardest part. It was like for me, just in that one time that I was trying it, like trying to just go through the act of remembering everything and keeping up. It was like, as they're moving on, it's kind of like if you don't know the basics, right? If you can't remember it up to a certain point, then it's just going to be kind of a terrible experience for you, especially if you're just trying it for the first time, because it's just like, wait, what move was that again? And probably as a dancer, once you're kind of off of one move, I'm sure it's probably difficult to jump back on to the right time. But if you do probably mess up more than once, right? Like it's totally off. It's like almost next to impossible to jump back on if you mess up like multiple times and you're offbeat or you forget something.
I imagine it's similar to how athletes feel in a sport like, say, basketball or tennis or something where you really have to have a lot of awareness of your body. I look at dance as a sport, or yeah, an athletic activity as well. Yeah, I mean, I early on I would take classes, and if I messed up, it would definitely throw me off, and it would be kind of a blow to my ego and my focus. That I would There were some classes where I would completely blank out and just forget the choreography and stand there kind of frozen. Um, or I remember there was one class where I was dancing, and then they were like, "All right, we're gonna record this one," and I was like, "No, there's gonna be a record of this," and just the thought of it being recorded, I froze and embarrassed myself more than if I just messed up, just trying the choreography. And it's tough. To this day, I think I still struggle with that. So I don't know, Mike, to encourage you, if you still want to dance, just know someone who's been dancing for 12 years still freezes up and messes up and gets nervous. It kind of never goes away. You just learn how to deal with it.
I think for me, I do enjoy dance, but just maybe not in a choreographed form. Just there's no pressure kind of whatsoever. But that does lead me kind of like to the question of, you know, looking at high school and college, you talked about going through struggles, remembering lines, not remembering, sorry, not remembering lines, remembering choreography, feeling, dejected sometimes, and sometimes it wasn't always the best session. Like, what was your coping mechanism like back then versus like, what it was in college, and like how did it change, right? Like as you kind of got older, and more seasoned as like a dancer.
I don't know if I had good coping mechanisms back then, other than I can't get it. I need to keep practicing. It was a work hard for what you're not good at, kind of thing for me. But maybe that's also because I really enjoyed it and I really wanted it. Um, I Yeah, like if I was messing up on the choreography, I would just practice it over and over again, sometimes for hours. Um, and it would be after school, and I'd be practicing kind of in the quad area, and all of a sudden it's 7:30 p.m. Clearly school has ended, the sun has set, and I'm here alone out in the cold, sweating, because I'm practicing choreography because I just want to get it down. So I think I've built a lot of discipline because of dance. Um, I'd say now where I still have to find some coping mechanisms when dance is difficult and I feel dejected, and it happens in real time. It is truly a mental exercise of, hey, the voice inside my head that is trying to tell me that I'm not worthy or good enough to continue in this class. Shut up, bro. Like, get out. Just keep going. Um, and more often than not, just keep going, or continuing to go, and dance classes will get you most of the way there. Yeah, I'd also say dance is such a social activity that being with people that you like and that celebrate you and you feel comfortable with, that has helped me so much in my dance journey of feeling like I don't belong or I don't have the choreography. Is the support really does something. I've been a part of a number of teams at this point, and I think I continue to go back to teams because there's a security of having a group of people who are invested in the same thing that you are doing, and can help you and process movement and the way something is taught in different ways, so that you can also be taught by them and supported by them. Um, there are dance classes that I take from teachers who I didn't know before, and who I now know better and have built a relationship with. And when I compare my experiences of now knowing them better to before, when I didn't know them that well, I do so much better now. And sure, it's because I've become familiar with their choreography and their movement. But I also chalk it up to just having a relationship with them, and feeling more comfortable with them as people. I think it's related to some of my insecurities of like, this person doesn't know me, and if they don't know me, the only thing that they'll judge is my dancing. And if I mess up, then I've I've tainted their perception of me. But the more I've built relationships with people, with choreographers, with teachers, the less I think about what they'll think of me in terms of my dancing, and the more I value and weigh how they know me as a person. And that makes me feel comfortable more in class and allows me, I feel, to do better in a class.
Do you think that being with other people in a team, because obviously the teachers, they know the choreo the best, right? Or because they're the ones teaching it, like they have this general structure down. But then when you're with other people in a class, right, like they're also going through the same things that you're going through, right? Maybe you're really good at certain parts, and they're, maybe you're not good at certain other parts, but they may be good at different parts that you're not good at. And so it's like you guys are learning collectively together, and you guys can share in those wins and share in those, um, I would say losses, right? But more of like the elements where you can improve together as a class. And so like that way it's not the burden all on you, or them or everyone, or like individually, to learn and be perfect, or not the burden to be perfect, right? But you guys learn together as a group. So I imagine that's probably what, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of the feeling experience that, teams provide, it seems like, to dancers, and just also having that community to build at a culture at a much more intimate level.
When done well, yes, that is what teams should be doing. Now, it is very possible, and it happens all the time, that teams don't know how to cultivate that kind of space, and it happens organically. But especially within the competition space, it cannot happen. It can become a really cutthroat, competitive space that is not conducive to support and feeling like you're around people that you like. Some competitive teams have started because simply that they're competitive, and it almost has been treated like work, but they're often not sustainable. And those teams don't really last that long.
Kind of want to go back to the college experience. So you mentioned, you joined a group, and talk to me about, your experiences with a college dance team, and the type of experiences that, you know, you learned how to basically improve upon what you had already learned in high school, and how that has kind of carried you into your kind of dance career today.
The first thing that comes to mind is um, I joined a dance community that didn't get a lot of studio time. What I mean by that, and this is a shared experience across many dance teams, at least within California, dance teams weren't always seen in colleges as legitimate student groups. Many of them were formed as not official student groups recognized by like the student government. And so we weren't afforded the same facilities like dance programs, or ballet or jazz, things like that. So we practice outside. And I mean, we talked already about kind of the mirror and dancers using the mirror, but often we didn't have one. Many dancers at Irvine, UCLA, UC Berkeley, not all the students have access to mirrored rooms. We dance outside. So we need the feedback of our teammates in order to tell us if we're doing well or not, which means we have to be open to receiving kind of their critiques and their dissent and their observations. Um, I think that's really helped me to receive feedback, and not just in like the dance sense, but even the professional sense. But I think that's really, yeah, that's prepared me in terms of, yes, hearing other people's observations, but also becoming more aware of my body, knowing how it's moving without seeing it, but just creating more bodily awareness. And that has served me so well in kind of my post collegiate pursuit of dance, because dance becomes a bit more complex when you leave the collegiate scene. You start to do maybe more experimental things, or you're now performing with people and it's like contact where you're part of a shape and someone's hands or body is on you, and you have to be really aware of your body. Or maybe you're dancing around more props or within a specific space, or you're dancing on a set, right, with a camera and actors and other people. the bodily awareness is so important. And I feel like I've built more of that because I needed, I was a sense, right, was taken away from me. I couldn't see my own body in the mirror. So I had to become accustomed to knowing what my body felt like.
Like, how did you know, like, you improved upon your bodily awareness? Like, is it just a feeling, right? Is it just like repetition of doing the same movements or similar movements, and just knowing how, if or when the timing feels right as you're, performing?
It's a constant discovery. I think no, becoming more aware of your body can look like becoming better at learning choreography because you're increasing your awareness of your body when you increase your dance vocabulary, right? So there's more awareness there. For me, being spatially aware has always been kind of fun. Like I I dance around my house, even if I'm the only one at home. I will like kind of pull on a doorknob and l- really enjoying the kind of sensation of the push or the pull that I can have, similar to like a dance partner if you're dancing like in pairs. And so I think for me, I've become more, I've been aware that I've become more bodily aware because I can kind of manipulate myself through spaces and achieve what I imagine in my head. Like, oh, cool, I can do that. Well, it would require this and this kind of weight shift and it's kind of like manipulation of my chest. And when you can set a challenge for yourself internally and mentally and then actually like manifest it and act it out, you're like, sick. I knew what I needed to do in order to achieve that. I could translate it from my head or from my psyche into actual movement, or I could follow someone's instructions. All of that I can understand kind of feels a bit nebulous, but truly, like as dancers, it feels good to be able to move about a space the way you want to, or often even surprising yourself. Like I didn't know I could do that, but I did. And in those moments, that is again another leveling up of your awareness. Like, whoa, my body is capable of that.
Like, dancing in your own room, like in such a confined space, or even just in more confined spaces, gave you a better awareness of kind of how to move? Because I imagine, like, let's say if you're on a dance team and you have, I don't know, 20, 30 people, right? Like, your movements have to be potentially flowy but concise, or not, well, maybe not concise is not the right word, but like constrained within a specific space. So do you think that, like, the dancing in the room in maybe smaller spaces gave you kind of the ability to manipulate your body in a way that you became more comfortable dancing in a confined space?
The space really matters. Um, I will say hmm, it's not a yes or no to your question for sure. I used to teach a weekly class when I lived in the Bay Area, and I would choreograph um, in mirrors that were much narrower than this. Kind of like your good old standard like standing mirror that you would maybe buy at a department store. And choreographing in that is really tough because you can't really move laterally without losing vision of yourself in the mirror. And so that provided constraints on movement. But I'd say that constraint actually helps a dancer to be able to think beyond the space that you have. I would hopefully I can explain this well, would choreograph within the sliver and maybe the choreography would take me somewhere else. And then I had to pause and kind of remember my positioning and translate myself back into front of the mirror to then continue it. But knowing that translation and that movement is not part of the choreography itself, so that once I piece it all together, I do end up somewhere else. But um, the process of creating it and dancing it out is a bit in piecemeal and a bit disjointed, right? And I think that disjointment and having to kind of piece everything together helps a dancer create more awareness and space, knowing that I have to do this or that I'm going to move here. I've found that when I've choreographed in more horizontal spaces, my choreography moves more horizontally. And a dancer who's aware knows that, okay, I know that this is my constraint and this is probably what will happen. How do I move beyond this constraint then? Well, how can I design within the movement so that I'm not bound by this space? So yeah, yes, the space does influence how one moves, but I find that the constraints are helpful for dancers to be more creative if they're going to pursue it, right? Like you could just be at the mercy of the constraint and not grow beyond it. But I mean, cool stuff. Innovation happens when you decide to go beyond it, and I found that for myself.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, high school and collegiate teams, especially because, you know, Christian, let me ask you this. What's the biggest dance group? Like, what's the biggest uh, what's the largest amount of people that you've had out dancing at the same time on one stage that you've been a part of?
On one stage simultaneously, like at the same time.
Yeah.
I was helping host a dance show in the Bay Area. At the time, it was called Urban Paradise, hosted by the company based in Daly City. Um, hmm, I had all the performers, so a number of dance teams from across California on stage to learn some choreography. It probably had to be like 700 or 800 people all on one stage doing some choreography. Yeah, so that many.
Okay. So I would imagine you have 700 to 800 people at one time. Everyone has to be mindful of the space, right? Like if you're all next to each other doing the same move at the same time, right? If someone takes maybe one step too far, you're going to bump into another person.
Yeah,
And so I think that's how it's interesting because like just thinking about dancing in a big group, right? And having to transition people off stage and on stage, right? I think that's one of the most unique things, particularly about high school and especially college dance, is the transition on and off stage with such a large number of people. Just because usually, like, when you see dance, in a music video now, like you're not going to have, generally speaking, as many backup dancers as you would, I would say, in my opinion, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, as a college dance group or high school dance group.
you're right there. It is impressive to move people coordinated on and off stage. I mean, this is why it takes so long to put together a set. I'm baffled still that I get to participate in something like this. Dance teams meet for weeks, months on end sometimes, putting hours and hours of rehearsal time, practice meetings to prepare the formations and the choreography. And sometimes all of that is for 5 minutes on stage. It's a huge amount of investment for such a short period of dancing and performing um, on stage. And it seems like the value proposition, right, doesn't always seem, it's kind of surprising, but it really is worth it. From a dancer's perspective, it just feels good. But it is tough. It takes a ton of work. Um, I to your point on it being particularly impressive for college teams, these are often students, right, who are studying things that they've never studied before. Many of them don't have jobs or are college students who are also trying to live, right, and pay for school. And yet they're also committing to a large extracurricular activity that requires so much of their time, their energy, their spiritual and like physical presence. It's a lot, and so it is impressive. Really impressive that dancers can do this on top of remembering choreography and all the other things of life. So I don't know, use the stage as like a both a uh, it's a figurative thing too, right? But it's all of it. It is quite impressive when you kind of zoom out and think about it.
Talk to me a little bit about your what was your daily kind of, or I would say daily or weekly kind of routine, right? As when you were in college, right? In terms of balancing the school side of it as well as the dance side of it. So kind of like walk me through it. I have like a general idea just from hearing about it and having dancer friends, but I kind of want to hear like your experiences from that in terms of managing both school and extracurricular dance.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's take a normal Tuesday for me in college. Wake up, go to 8 a.m. class, have a full day of classes. Well, let's say in the middle of the day around lunchtime, I'll go meet up with my dance team because someone is tabling on the main kind of student plaza, because we're trying to either recruit more members or market for some kind of event, like a fundraising event or a dance show that we have. We're trying to sell tickets to a show that we are hosting, and that act itself of kind of tabling and having dance community and other people around in a public space was another kind of big part of community. But naturally, you have dancers there who are in their free time, and we might practice some of the choreography. So it might be like, hey, does anybody want to meet me at the tables tomorrow at 11:30 so you can catch me up or review the choreography? Um, I might go back to class after that. Honestly, still probably practicing the choreography in my mind, but trying to focus on school. Um, then maybe go to office hours, but still focused on dance. And maybe this is where I say it is hard to balance and compartmentalize as um at least it was for me. I was pretty academic in high school, but I don't think my high school prepared me well for how challenging UC Berkeley would be. Um but I really liked
To one of the best schools in the nation. So it's quite impressive already.
fair enough. Yeah, I mean, but I have to say it was tough. Like I actually was on academic probation, and then I had to like stop regular school for a little bit because my grades were not good. And I credit or maybe discredit rather some of that, yes, to some personal things, but also because I was wildly distracted by dance, and it pulled at my focus a good amount. Um, it's a bit of an issue with the dance community of like these folks get into school and they can't focus on their academics because they're so immersed in an activity that really is life-giving, but um, you go into the deep end and you kind of lose sight of why you're in school or how expensive it is and and what opportunities it can provide you when you once you graduate. um, but yeah, I wasn't studying a whole bunch, but I was dancing a lot. um, I would grab dinner, and then rehearsal would start around 8 p.m. And so maybe before that, I would meet up with people to practice choreography or maybe work on formations. And then rehearsal will be from like 8 to 11. And sometimes, often, it would extend, especially if we had a show or a competition coming up. There were days when we rehearsed till midnight, 1, 2 a.m. On some campuses, they have things called sunrise practices where you practice until the sun comes up, and then somehow you find sleep and then you go to class or work.
Really, really hard. Um, I remember like if there was like a performance. So I was part of this college group called Chinese Association at UCI, and as part of our, I guess you call them like part of our subsidiaries or branch groups that were associated with us. It was called CADC, which stands for Chinese Association Dance Crew. They may have changed names like as of late. It's been like 15 years, or probably almost 17. Yeah,
Still the same, actually.
oh, really? Okay. Um, so they would perform for all of like our like cultural nights, or if we had like inner team, inner I don't know, collegiate group dance competitions and stuff like that, and they would go through like what was called Hell Weeks, and I'm sure I don't know if it was called the same for you guys, but they would start practice at 7 p.m. in the parking lot, and they would practice straight to like 4 a.m. every single day for that week in preparation, uh, leading up to a big event or something like that. So it was quite really impressive, to be honest. Like I also had a friend who was, I think she was like a civil engineer, and one of the dance members in the group was also like a civil engineer as well, and she was like, "Wow, that's really impressive that this person is an engineer and doing dance like at the same time." To kind of piggyback off your point about balancing school, and work.
Yeah, it it's not easy to balance it, but it's such a pool. We talked about how much of it is community based, and I think that's why there's such a pull to it. There's such an attraction to it. Is because you're doing an activity that is fun. It's physical. It's community building. But dance is also a very vulnerable activity where if you think about other art forms, say painting, for example, the artist gets to paint it and then the art piece itself can be viewed without the artist having to be around. In fact, that person, the artist, could pass away or disappear, but the art would still exist. But when you are a dancer, you are both the art and the artist simultaneously. And so you are offering your all of yourself in your creation, in your movement, in your being as the artist and the art. And so it's a very vulnerable thing. And when you're vulnerable with people, you form relationships. And so you build a lot of community. And I've built a lot of community through dance for this reason. And you just spend a lot of time with each other. And it's you form a lot of close relationships. Most of my closest friends, are from dance. And I've known them for now 11, 12 years. But it all started because we were on the same dance team together and we just got really vulnerable in terms of movement, but also just building a relationship and being able to understand each other well. Um, and a lot of that stems from those hell weeks or those late night practices where we dance together for hours and then we'd go get boba after rehearsal because that was the way to end rehearsal, or end the night rather. And then maybe if we had the energy, we would stay up and study because we had a midterm the next day. So just a lot of time spent together in college because dancing and shared experiences.
I want to actually learn a little bit more, kind of moving past college into, your post kind of collegiate dance experiences, and what does it kind of look like for someone who maybe did dance during college, and how they sort of can continue to enjoy kind of that same sort of community, but instead of having to deal with schoolwork, now you deal with adult life, or you deal with having a job and other things that come with the responsibility of being an adult.
Post college, I found myself still wanting to dance, and I actually was going back to UC Berkeley to practice with teams or with groups that were made up of people who also danced in college but just wanted to keep doing it. And we returned to campus because that was the place that felt familiar and the space was free to occupy. And so post college, I joined teams like that. Namely, one of them was like Team Velociraptors at UC Berkeley, or even there was an alumni team of my collegiate team called Senior Stacks, the college version being called Main Stacks. Um, we just had built such great and strong community that we wanted to come together. But naturally, that kind of the rhythms and fashion of these teams change. It's not the same. We can't have these late night rehearsals, and they couldn't be as frequent. And so they'd be once a week, and then they might be seasonal. Um, but I also think a lot of like dancing on a team is not feasible for someone post college as they start to balance work and maybe a family or increased kind of commitments of becoming more of an adult. And so a lot of dancers resort to just taking classes in the local area. I think I mentioned earlier, I used to teach regularly intermediate advanced class in Oakland at In the Groove Studios in downtown Oakland. Shout out to In the Groove. Yeah, been a home for many dancers in the Bay Area, especially for people who graduated from UC Berkeley and were looking for a community that kind of fit their age and their stage of life. Um, they did offer a team, and many people auditioned for that team, and it has some of the similar things that a collegiate team would provide, which is community, which is time to spend together, time to eat after a rehearsal, or even shows to compete at or just to exhibit, and see other dancers and maybe your old friends from your old college. But a lot of people just like taking class because it's a low commitment thing, but you get to see people that you know regularly. You get to dance like you did in college. You get sweaty. It feels like a workout. And at this point, you have money, right? Like you're choosing into taking this class. So it was a way to feel like you were investing in yourself and putting your money to work for you. And it was fun. And it was kind of pouring back into the community too. So I'd say that's definitely a way for dancers post college to get back into it or to keep it consistent, which is to take classes with people. And of course, classes are designed to improve a dancer, right? You're looking to better your craft, and the teacher, if they are a good one, is equally as invested in doing that for you and with you. Yeah, I'd say classes of some sort or programs like that are really instrumental in making dance accessible post college. Yeah.
Would you say that the type of dance experience, like, well, actually, let me ask you this: does the dance experience post college, like when you're taking a class, meeting new people, making friends as adults, right? Like, how does that differ post like the experience in high school? Like you talked about the money and the community building, but is it more expansive in terms of the types of dances that you're learning? I'm guessing that you also have like traveling or resident or guest uh, dance teachers like as well. Is it something where you learn more choreo? Like, is it a one-time session? Is it like like learning a choreo over, maybe 3 weeks or however many days, etc.? Like, talk to me about the differences when you're going through dance classes at a.
It's so vastly different, Mike. Yeah, it's so vastly different. I'd say once you're post college, well, let me describe the college scene first from like a 10,000-foot view. Often the collegiate choreography scene is to prepare a dance set that will be performed at some kind of competition or show. And often the dancing is so everyone looks clean and uniformed, and it's not very individual. And so what comes of that is people who train to look clean and have clean lines and look like the person next to them and to match the choreographer as closely as they can. And that can happen in a class setting. But I also say that it doesn't. That individuality, I think, is more celebrated in a class setting because you're paying for the class. You're here to learn for you, and depending on the intention of the class or why you're there, you may just want to show out and dance. And so the focus is not the same. The focus is not to create a set and not to necessarily look like the person next to you. The purpose is for you to get something out of this class because you paid for it. Now, the teacher may have an expectation of like, you should be clean and you should look like me, but that is very different than kind of the space that is created for a collegiate scene. It's also different because there's different dance forms and variations that are offered in classes after college. In college, collegiate teams, particularly in California, but it's happened in the East Coast and really across the world now, the dancing looks often similar because these are dancers who are they maybe only just started dancing in college, and so their skill level is still developing, and they're trying to emulate specific choreographers and dance teams that have gained popularity through social media like YouTube or Instagram or Facebook. Many of these being Asian American, really amazing dancers, but kind of put on a pedestal, and everyone just wanting to follow that trend or to try what those amazing choreographers were doing. But when you get to a class setting where there's a long history of dance educators and people who are steeped in hip hop and other dance forms, you get to branch out. And so I think it looks different because you can learn something that you've never even touched in college or you didn't know the name of, and you're learning it or can learn it from people who have been doing this for 10, 15, 20, potentially even 30 or 40 years. So I think post college dance looks completely different. I think what's happening now is dance dance could look like that in college settings because you build really strong habits as you're in college. um, that it shouldn't be a surprise when you get to a studio that you can learn a form like locking or a form like break-in, and it shouldn't feel so foreign. Like why are these things happening not as the foundation but as something post a collegiate scene? And it's actually a really big conversation right now in the dance community.
Or I was going to ask, how do you feel like your skill level has evolved, right, since being in a dance team, right, like at Berkeley versus, being, a dancer now, right? Like, talk to me a little bit about that progress personally for yourself, and I think it would be a really great story and perspective to share.
Yeah, I was that dancer who was focusing on choreography and on looking clean, and that that has been the my thing, because that's what I grew up watching on YouTube. I wanted to be a part of specific teams. I think now post college, I have joined dance teams that have focused more on freestyle and on different dance forms that are outside of just choreography or that have specific names and specific deep seated histories. I currently dance with a company called Culture Shock Los Angeles, based here in LA. And they focus on dance education and uh, working with youth and just engaging with the community. Right now, we're training in specific styles. I, in particular, have picked break in um, to to train in, and I already feel like last night we had rehearsal, and I'm pretty sore and feeling it as it's foreign movement to me for sure. But it's already I can already feel like I'm up leveled as a dancer.
I guess, Christian, to pull it back, like what is break-in?
Mm. A lot of people know this as breakdancing. You may have heard it as the dancing that like B boys or B girls do. Breakin' comes from New York City, where hip hop was born. And it is a street dance form, and one of the pillars of hip hop. And so breaking looks like those the moves that you might see where dancers are dancing on the floor, and maybe spinning or moving quickly with their feet as they're supporting their body with their arms. It's that kind of movement, and it could look like flips or like spins on your head. But that is break in, and I there's probably better words to describe what that is, but hopefully with that description you get an idea of what break in is.
Yeah, I definitely have a much better kind of idea of that, and what it actually is. And then talk to me a little bit about how, you know what it felt like to learn and go through like this particular style of dance, like in a post collegiate setting?
I got to give props to Culture Shock because it's so much of dance education today is often void of the history. Um, Much of dance as we know it across the globe and across history actually all stems from Black art forms. We pull a lot of breakdancing grooves and movement from different, mostly Black communities, but indigenous communities too. And so it felt really significant for me to learn these movements and forms because they inform what I've done throughout college. They inform the choreography. Um, it also feels really difficult and kind of a blow to my ego because I'm not good at it. Breaking requires a lot of physical strength, but much like anything else that requires a lot of physical strength, like other sports or weightlifting, it requires a lot of mental strength as well. And being able to kind of push through what hurts or what feels really difficult or really impossible. So for me, it's felt challenging, but it's also felt really fun. And fun for the reasons of me being able to be with community and struggling together with them and in being encouraged by them, but also fun because it's kind of like figuring stuff out for yourself. I feel like I'm being taken back a bit to when I was practicing in my mirror those dance moves that my aunt brought home from a rave. I'm having to workshop these things, or we might say lab them on my own. Post this call, I'll probably be in this space right behind me trying to figure out, how to do a 6-step, which is a movement on the floor that involves 6 different steps of kind of like rotating your body around. Um, it's it's so tough, but I don't know, it feels really good to engage my body and to kind of unlock different positions or different moves. And it's not just a physical thing. Like I said, it's a mental thing too.
Do you feel that you basically get to go through this duality of being, the student again, uh, relative to maybe something else, another dance that you've gained, relative mastery in, and it's just that constant going back and forth between being the student and the master and starting from scratch almost, right? Like you have some basics, and I'm sure there's some commonalities, but uh, you know, talk to me about that feeling of learning something new, going back to something that you know really well, and then going back again, right? Just that continuous cycle.
It's absolutely humbling, to say the least. I Sometimes it doesn't feel good to be a student, right? Like it's the struggle is tough. You don't always experience the payoff of being a student because you have to continue working at it. For me, that's what it feels like to learn breaking right now. It's extremely tough. And then I'll go maybe take a choreography class at a studio from someone who their style feels familiar to me, or I've learned their kind of set of vocabulary, or even just being in that setting of I've been to hundreds of classes at this point, and so I know what to expect, and I know that it'll require me to listen to music, and that I can kind of pick apart music and almost anticipate what might happen. Um, and so, yeah, I do oscillate between what feels like familiar spaces or familiar movement to now it kind of feels like a disruption of I'm using my body in a different way. And going between those two, I, I'd rather have it this way, right? I mean, we are very routine based beings, being humans, but I don't know, it just makes life more rich and interesting to challenge myself, and try it out and put myself in kind of uncomfortable situations. Yeah, it's a different way to move about the world. Literally, like I'm moving in different ways depending on if I'm in a class where I feel familiar and I can do my thing and I know what I'm doing. And then with breaking, a completely new art form, at least to me, that I haven't trained in at all, not proficient in. But if I keep going, I build some proficiency, and hopefully I get to a point where I can start to feel more comfortable, that I can push myself into another space where it isn't comfortable, and then we just level up and continue to do that. Um, yeah, it's not easy, and I gotta say it requires breaks and kind of a long-term vision for pursuing it. But I don't know. I think I've over time post college I've learned the payoff is going to continue to be further down the line, but it's worth it.
I guess that brings me to one of the other points that I wanted to ask you is like during your post collegiate kind of dance career, I'm sure you've uh, leveled up or you've gained more experience in terms of how to take care of your body or how to prepare for a dance routine or even a practice or a class, right? And also how to decompress from all of that, how to rest and recover. So talk to me about like that experience in terms of just mentally and physically and emotionally preparing and decompressing to recover after a dance session or before a dance session.
I have to shout out Keone and Mario Madrid, who are these amazing dancers from San Diego, California, and also led uh, this amazing dance team that I looked up to called Choreo Cookies. But I think they were some of the first people who, at least within my community and my circles, evangelized treating dance as a sport and training like an athlete in order to engage in this sport. Um, they used their social media presence to do many things, but one of the things that they did was show how they trained with a personal trainer so that they could be better dancers. And I think that had a huge influence on the dance community. I'll say today I engage with a personal trainer, and my training is focused on stability and agility and being a better, more mobile, athletic dancer. And I see a lot of the dancers that I look up to now and who are my contemporaries, and many of them are also doing the same thing. And I consider this a part of my preparation, where when I show up and we have a part of a rehearsal when we're conditioning, I want to feel prepared and able to take on the exercises that we're going to go through and not have to struggle through them like I felt like I was struggling when I was in college, because I didn't have the right tools. I wasn't focusing on like the right muscle groups or even just the same consistency and cadence that I am now. And so now I feel like I'm a stronger, more prepared dancer because I condition and exercise outside of rehearsal. When I think about decompression, uh, it's definitely rolling out and making sure I stretch out and take care of my body before I go to sleep. But actually, what comes to mind for decompression is spending time in community. And maybe that's just a habit, but that hasn't changed since college. It is maybe a cultural thing to post post rehearsal or post practice or post performance to just hang out and chat and debrief the performance or just spend time with people, get boba, get food. That almost is a must for any kind of like post dance thing is some kind of community time. Um, so yeah, I think that's really important. But also is taking care of your body and like maybe it's a massage gun or rolling out with a foam roller. But yeah, the physical kind of preparation and then post is absolutely crucial, especially as you get older and are post college.
Right. Right, because like our bodies are not necessarily as naturally as malleable as before, unless we're taking care of our bodies and you know conditioning it in ways that maybe we might not have in college. Um, I did want to ask. Well, actually, I one thing I did want to I noted and observed I when you were talking about decompressing and spending more time with community. Do you think that it could be because you're you mentioned dance is a very emotional and vulnerable kind of routine and experience. And now you get to sort of share and partake and kind of release some of that through chatting with other people after dance sessions and things like that. Like it's a different form of like you don't necessarily have to be in the moment of like you are in dance, but you can also just more freely just share in it with a larger group of people.
Hmm. I, 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 it's not intentional. I think it just kind of comes. It's a byproduct of being vulnerable with people after an extended period of dancing and just spending time and all bodies are kind of in the same place. It's oh yeah, you feel closer. I remember there was one rehearsal where we were doing some contact freestyle and I had just felt closer to the people that I danced with and emotionally. And I think that's normal. But I think that's kind of common amongst humans who naturally like, when we're in close proximity with people, normally that comes with intimacy. And this was a non-romantic version of like physical closeness, but I I felt closer to them emotionally and like better friends because we moved together. And I think that does require trust and vulnerability and a comfort that you maybe or that I couldn't achieve solely by just talking. Um, there's something about movement and movement together that does bring people together. Um, yeah.
I did want to get to, talking about the best way to, teach choreo, and as a student, when you're the student, what's the best way to receive and approach that choreo?
I'll start from the teacher's perspective. I think there's a lot of responsibility, rightfully so, for someone who is teaching a class or is teaching choreography. A choreographer is not necessarily a teacher. I think the responsibilities are different. A choreographer can come up with the moves, but they may not necessarily have the toolkit or be prepared to share that movement with people. Now, when you teach dance, it's so much more than just teaching moves. One, it's being aware of where the movement comes from a historical perspective, from a contextual perspective. And so when you relay these moves and explain them to others, can you cite where these come from, where this movement is inspired by, or where it's rooted in? I mentioned before that much of our movement that we do today and much of the music that we move to today comes from African roots, comes from the Black community. And I think it's a question and a challenge and a call for all teachers is how well do you know where these art forms and this music comes from? And can you assign the right credit to the source so that we're not erasing that culture or not erasing where it actually came from? So I think that's a call and a challenge that I have for teachers is you should know what you're doing and moving, and so that you can actually educate the people who are going to continue to do this after you. Um, te- Students are eventually going to grow into teachers, and they are also going to share their knowledge. And I think it is the responsibility of a teacher to be able to know what it is that they're passing on and where it comes from, because so much of the culture and the richness and the authenticity of that movement is embedded within that history, and so it's needed.
I guess I was gonna say my question to that would be like where do people where can people learn and discover like where uh, the origins of a lot of the dance moves were inspired from? Like how do they become more educated about it, other than just taking dance classes and whatnot? Like are there any other sort of resources that people should be looking at to better inform themselves of where these things are coming from.
The internet is a great resource. I'd say you can learn a lot about dance history and different dance forms from YouTube itself alone. But there are groups out there, and even people within higher education spaces that are focused on making dance education more robust and more inclusive of Black art forms. Historically, dance education has kind of been limited to European and white versions of dance that still have pulled inspiration from and benefited largely from Black art forms, but are often not. But Black forms are artists are not often credited. So, yeah, I would say do the search on YouTube. Look up the history of dance moves from different eras. I would say even watching old videos of Soul Train, which is a dance show that was shot in LA in like the 70s and 80s. And you'll see a lot of these dancers, mostly dancers of color, who are doing moves that have inspired choreography and movement that we see today. But we didn't even know that it existed back then because media is just moving so fast. But even just taking the time to explore what dance looked like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and following that paper trail can lead to unlocking a lot of that history. Monsell Durden is a professor for USC who teaches on dance history and the origins of dance. And so you'll learn a lot about the different forms that have created the foundation and basis for what we know dance and music to be today. A lot of dance teams, collegiate and outside of the college scene, are now dedicating time to learning more about where these things have come from. I'd say if you are plugged into a studio or have any access to social media, look for these dance leaders, these people that you look up to, and engage them. I think that's a way to learn too, is where did you learn what you know? Where did it come from? I think it come to learn something. It comes from a place of curiosity, and that is absolutely true for dance. Ask your teachers where they got it from. Look for their sources and continue to dig back into each of those sources, and you'll find something. I was guilty of this for sure, of like just receiving what I was getting through dance and not questioning or not being curious about where it came from. But I've just discovered so much and learned so much when I started to be more curious about why it is that dance is what it is, or who it came from, or why is it that I can benefit from it, and where did that benefit come from? Why is it so fun? Why is this movement this way, or why is it similar to this indigenous practice? So yeah, start with YouTube. And there are also like speakers and people in the community. Yeah.
I can imagine that you feel much more knowing the history, you feel much more connected to the origins of the dance move, but also the spirit in which, the expression that's supposed to be conveyed, right? Like, I think I would imagine it makes just even the movement, but just more rich, the way that you express it, much more rich and fulfilling versus just like, oh, I saw this move on TikTok, right? And like, it's a thing. It just probably feels a lot more shallow, I would imagine, without that kind of educational piece.
Absolutely. And I think like engaging in these different dance forms connects you to a history that precedes me for sure, but precedes many of us who have been dancing for a while. I I could do, for example, like I could whack, right, which is a move of, and there's different variations of it. And if I don't know the history behind it, then it is just a movement. But if one understands that this style was done by gay men in the clubs of LA, and simultaneously there was another art form called voguing that was happening within the underground clubs of New York City, also by like gay men, or trans women, as an expression and of resistance, and in response to not being accepted in uh, more uh, like non queer or friendly spaces, then you wouldn't know that. And again, it would just be a movement. But there's so much more to that than just a movement. There's an identity there. There's a history there. There's a resistance there. There's oppression there. There's people's lived experiences. Often dance is related to being someone's out, or someone's refuge, someone's life, because everything else in their life was not accessible to them or not safe. And so when we reduce dance to just movement and we fail to learn about the history, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we're not honoring the people who allowed us to have this. So to me, it's 100% necessary to pay homage and respect to those who provided us the movement and the music to enjoy it today. It's kind of like, I don't know, dissing your grandparents, like, you know what I mean?
I was going to say, I think one of the things that's interesting is when you look at more formalized dance, maybe not formalized, more institutionalized dance, whether it's like salsa or, ballroom dancing, or maybe it's ballet, right? Or things that are typically have long rooted histories. They often are used to tell a story, right? And the movements are there to tell a story. If you think about like capoeira, right? Like that's something where it was a way to communicate with other people through kind of song and dance, because they didn't want, the slave traders, right, to, recognize like that they were actually telling stories, like, and communicating. So I think that's one of the interesting things about, I think what you brought up is the history of dance and how it's an older form of storytelling.
Well, absolutely. Whether it was good or not, I mean, the slaves of old were sometimes brought in by their slave owners to just be entertainment, and so Black people were brought in to just dance and sure tell a story, but it was a form of entertainment too. But over time, it has become kind of like legitimized. There were Black performers who were even mocking white kind of elite through their storytelling when they had to perform. And again, it was like a form of resistance and expression, and a way for them to survive. Uh, yeah, and then we experience and see how dance has prevented or helped people from getting into wrongful activity, whether it be overuse or just abusive use of drugs or even gang activity. I mean, there's so many stories where dance has just saved people's lives, and that itself is a story. And that's why it's so beautiful and useful for kind of connecting with people.
I feel like just throughout this conversation, I've really gotten to appreciate, how much knowledge and how important like knowing the history is behind something, just from your perspective, even just from the charisma of, the importance of it. Just, I mean, I think history in general is just very important, but just think hearing it from like a dance perspective and how it's actually being applied kind of in real life, or the importance of it and the advocacy of it, is something that like I'm very appreciative of in terms of this conversation, right now.
And I appreciate you receiving that. I think it's so important, and I'm glad that it has a space on this pod. It's it's I have to say it can be really tough to feel like history should be a part of this. Some people just want to dance, and that has been a very kind of common response to when dance education kind of comes into play. Is like, yo, dude, I'm just trying to move. Like, why do we have to spend time learning about this? Like, why why does it matter? But it just, again, it's paying homage and paying respects, and giving credit where credit is due. We wouldn't have these if the history of dance didn't exist, and the people who brought hip hop forward didn't exist. I just learned yesterday that Cedric Avenue in the Bronx in New York City was renamed. I think, oh gosh, I'm gonna butcher this. I think it's like Street of Hip Hop or the birthplace of hip hop. Um, and how many of us know where hip hop comes from? But it did start out in a house where DJ Kool Herc was hosting a party, and that's something that many of our like generations younger don't know, even older generations, where hip hop had come from, a place in the United States, in a community of color, of Black and brown folks. Yet now hip hop is thrown around and is one of the biggest genres in music of today. It's so popular and world renowned. But do we know where it comes from? Like, there's so many other things in history that we know where things come from. People look up where electricity came from, or where popcorn came from, or where we have like the wheel. Do we know where hip hop comes from? Do we know what it's about? Where its histories are? Who are the people that made it come about? Do we know that there's also women who helped make hip hop become a thing? Like, it's such a rich history that we don't spend enough time thinking about and engaging in, but has enabled us to enjoy so many of the pleasures of life. And this is where I think we're at an inflection point now, where we have a critical amount of history and an ability to access these things. Why not understand it more?
I mean, it's a super profound like thought, and I think it takes a certain level of like individual responsibility as well as curiosity, like the curiosity to really want to deeply engage with it. And I think, you mentioned how in the dance community, you were saying like people just want to do the movements, right? Like maybe it's just for lack of education. Maybe it's for maybe things like social clout. You see someone doing Fortnite dances, right? Like maybe this is more for the younger generation. You want to, it's like their form of community, right? But maybe not necessarily um, an area of focus that they're looking at. And I do agree that there needs to be, more education kind of in the space, but it's also like, how do you make that education much more apparent in a way that is understood through more progressive entertainment lens? And I use the word progressive because, it has to come from a good place, not necessarily uh, with the lens of, hey, I'm going to use this just for, entertainment purposes, right? Like there has to be, I don't know, something instilled in it, right? That it's just like a message behind the entertainment kind of piece, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. There's always something more behind it.
Because like no one really wants to learn from like a history book, right? Like it's kind of a boring, for most people, probably a boring way to absorb information. Nowadays, everything kind of has to have like an edutainment kind of feel to it in order for anything to really get taken off the ground.
Right. Yeah. I think, and with dance, it is built within the DNA of it, right? Like, there are histories behind moves. Sometimes you can find the history in the name, but even as doing it, or I mean, even music. We think about kind of, yeah, like the origins of like jazz or blues coming from, um, like the spirituals of the slaves who were in the field, and tracing that back to what they brought from Africa of like chants. Like, the the art form itself is embedded with history. So participating in it is, I don't know, it's an invitation to learn it. Um, it's not just out of a book.
Yeah, I do want to. I think this is a good kind of transition point to talk about how music is becoming much more global, right? Like, initially, probably, in the last 20 years or so, it's gone from like being a very like US centric uh, focus on media going, or I would not say the last 20, I would say almost the last like 50, 60 years where you have like, Michael Jackson and, the Backstreet Boys, right? And, boy bands. And now you have like a proliferation of music, whether it's Afro beats, J-pop, K-pop, rap, hip hop. Like you have all these combine or not competing. You have all these different genres of music, right, that are coming from everywhere. And to a certain point degree, I feel like they really cross pollinate within the U.S. specifically. Um, and so I kind of want to get your take in terms of just how you've seen sort of music change, how you've seen, the kind of dance performances have changed over time, as music has become a much more uh, global, a global popularity, a global scene, especially in the United States.
Are you prepared for my spicy take, Mike? I'm not sure. Are the listeners prepared? I hope. I hope this is why y'all are tuning in for the spicy take. And maybe it's not spicy.
I mean, I'm ready. I'm ready to learn.
Yeah. Maybe it's not spicy. I mean, we've had conversations like this before. I will share. It is maybe my biggest gripe of the dance community, which is largely Asian American, at least within California. But I say the same is true for collegiate dance communities in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, in uh, Texas, in Arizona, in Hawaii, in the Pacific Northwest. Uh, yeah, even in like parts of the South, that there is a failure to recognize the influence of hip hop and of Black artists and of Black movement. Um, what we've seen in the dance community is an increase in the use of hip hop music, um, and not an increase in the one engagement in in where hip hop came from in the history, and also not an increase in the amount of Black people in the dance community. Um, and still a lack of, yeah, I guess is repeating my point, but a lack of engagement of what kind of place Asians and Asian Americans have. um and so how I think this manifests is like, for a while there was a bunch of like dance teams who were using hip hop with N words kind of like throughout the music. And this is my take, but I find it extremely inappropriate, um, to just use a song that has um, a bunch of language that, in my opinion, is for a specific group, of people. Now, I don't think that because it has the N word or describes lived situations or lived experiences of a people group, that it disqualifies people from listening to it, but rather using it for your own kind of personal gain or for your artistic expression without understanding the context or the significance of that song for that particular people or that particular artist, I think is irresponsible. And yeah, I've known way too many people within the dance community, Asian American, mostly men, who are using the N word as a joke or as a thing that they can just say because it has no consequences on them and they don't care about the history. And it's shown up in how dance has kind of manifested in the community, where they don't care where the song comes from or what kind of movement they're doing. It's just cool, and it provides them the social status and the social clout, that elevates them and makes them feel like they're participating in something that, is fun and cool and gives them more status. Um, And that really pisses me off because it is pretty much by definition like appropriation. And appropriation I don't think is always the problem. It's just the lack of engagement. It's not giving credit where credit is due and acknowledging the oppression and kind of the history behind it.
Do you think it comes from a place of like ignorance or just like lack of, well, I guess that's ignorance, lack of education on that particular topic, um, or does it come from just not really caring, right, like about it?
I do think it comes from a place of ignorance. I also think it does come from a long seated history of anti Blackness. And this comes from largely our ancestors and people before our generation, right? Like, uh, who, we live in a country where there has been a history of pitting people of color against each other. We've seen it here in LA, like the LA riots of like black and brown communities pitted against Asian communities in 1992. Thinking about right, like the LA riots. Um, it's I have my own family members, some that had passed and some still living, who are kind of blatantly racist and will make comments about black folks. Um, there is a colorism aspect to it too, where in the Philippines, in Korea, in many parts of Asia, there's soap to make your skin more light and white, and it's seated in this concept and this idea that being darker is bad. Where does all of this come from? Um, so I think it does come from an ignorance, but it also comes from a history.
For that particular portion, like the colorism part, I think it's really about status, right? Like, maybe I used to hear stories of how like people who didn't work in the fields, right, their skin, quote unquote, would be fairer, right? And people, that was a differentiating status kind of thing. I think that goes back historically, like for probably decade or not decades, probably at least centuries of just this belief that fair was always better, right? Or just that you just didn't have to work the fields, that you were richer, you could have a much more comfortable life. You probably were a emperor, empress, like someone of high status. Like if you think about even just today, when you think about, you're mentioning the skincare stuff, how many East Asian um, models do you see, or even just Asian models do you see that are of darker skin, especially when you see advertisements in Asia, right? Like everyone, for the most part, the sign of beauty, right, is fair skin. So it's definitely still rooted, right, even within East Asian culture, historically. And I think, you know, as part of the Asian American experience, you have different people and generations coming over, right, to America, right? Like you have people whose parents, are second generation. You have some people's parents, that are, I don't know, they're coming over for the first time now. Like my parents, right? They were born here. My grandparents came during like the, I don't know, what is it, 1920s, right? The Angel Island and the history books kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, racism was still pretty prevalent even then. And the funny thing is, like, when I talk to, my friends who are second generation Asian, and I talk to my mom and I hear her stories, like I triangulate the two. Like they're actually very similar. Uh, regardless of, I think it's a generational thing, whether it's like they either pick it up here or it's they bring over the attitudes from East Asia over here, or how, maybe people of color are seen, right, in Asia, right? Like they bring over those same kind of attitudes, and I feel like that's something that's not really talked about like a lot, just because like it's not as quote unquote American, right? But I think for more recent immigrants, like they do bring over, as much as they bring over their skills and experiences, they also do bring over, right, like a lot of the attitudes, for better or for worse, right? Like, or cultural beliefs that were based from over there, right? Like, it's, let's say, for example, not even like kind of excluding like Black people, right? Like, you know, Chinese people use, probably Indonesians, Filipino people, right, historically as mates, right? Like in Hong Kong, right? Like there's a colorism and a status kind of thing, like even there too, right? So I mean, it definitely, that's why I think it exists at a much broader spectrum. And it's a combination of, you know, East Asia colorism, as well as it complicates it, a little bit more here because it's also relevant from, American, I wasn't say domestic policy, but just like, can't really find the right words to say it, but it's a domestic issue here, right? A socio political and interracial issue here. So it makes it really complicated, I think.
I agree. It is complex where it's starting to kind of mingle and integrate or become greater in complexity is that, like you said, this music has traveled. Black music has traveled the world, and we see the influence of it in K-pop, in artists who want to sound like the Black sound that we have here in the U.S. Um, but what what comes from that? What comes of the emulation of the sound without actually like understanding the source? Um, like you got a copy, but do you understand? Like, is there the understanding of like the experience that has informed the sound? Um, and that I think that's where there's some missed opportunity for connection and for engagement. There is we lose that when it's just an appreciation for the music alone.
All right, so this is kind of like my hot take is, we have K-pop bands. We got what, 88 Rising, right? New label. But I think it's what, only like 3 years old, right? Or maybe four. Well, actually, it's probably been longer. Probably like five, right? Roughly 5 years old. Kind of started with Joji, Rich Brian when they started to take off. I think in like 2000, 17. And I went to the Heads and Clouds concert. Like I don't really go to that many concerts, but my girlfriend, she really loves Jackson Wang and Jay Cho. So those were like the headliners that
Magic Man.
Magic Man, yes. And it's great, I think, for Asian representation in media, right? Just to see ourselves, whether like it's Asian American representation, I think that's a totally different story. Like I think economically, right, and social, like society wise, right, and in terms of Asian American culture, there are a lot of people who are second generation Asians. I would say that's probably the majority, of Asians probably here in America. Um, but I think that the interesting thing about that, and maybe this is just maybe me living as an Asian person in California, and also for me, I'm third generation. So my parents were born here, so I didn't really have like a strong connection to stuff that would happen in Asia. Um, but all my friends, my Asian friends would, right? They'd be like, "Oh, have you heard of this artist? Right? Have you, they were up to date on Asian media, right? Like in a way where it was totally focused, like their world was kind of focused on that, right? Versus, some of the more mainstream stuff here. Like they live the best of both worlds, I guess you could say, from a media consumption perspective. And the reason why I bring that up is because I feel like a lot of people who really, really like 88 Rising, and in certain, certain members or certain people in 88 Rising, they really take their authority from like kind of like what happens in Asia. Like if you think about like K-pop fandom, right? Like it's not what happens here in the US, right? It's really like what concert did they perform at in Korea, right? Like they're following the news and the stuff around them, right? In when whatever's happening in Asia. And so I feel like it's, we talked about, or I guess I talked about like being in between both cultures. And so it's really taking that authority from what's happening, right, in that East Asian media culture, or like specifically, not to say that they can't separate the two, But if kind of someone doesn't really care about the politics or the history behind it, that's where they're going to take their media authority from. Like it's going to be the same media authority that if I'm a fan in, I don't know, I'm guessing like Singapore or the Philippines, I'm a fan of a person, right? I'm going to have the same language in terms of how I understand, this artist, whether, for better or for worse. There's a popularity aspect of being in the know, right? Of associated with other people who are also into that kind of artist, especially because they're not mainstream in America, right? Like if you tell someone like that's not in an Asian circle, like, oh yeah, I went to Head in the Clouds, this label called 88 Rising, right? Like probably not everyone's really gonna know, right? Like how many if you ask a random person, even another Asian person, right? Like, do you know who Jackson Wang is? They'll probably be like, who's that? But if you say who BTS is, they'll probably vaguely know, right? Like there's levels, I think, to who the 88 Rising K-pop audience really is for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like we may think it's big here, but if you think about on a global scale, like popularity in Japan, Korea, like Southeast Asia, which they're also doing whatever, like another showing there, right? It's actually quite big. And I think, from Indonesia. Um, and so it's actually so much bigger than I think sometimes people realize. But I think from a Western media perspective, it's like, oh, if they're not really that popular here, why do I care about, you know, uh, these bands, right, that are popular in Asia or whatever? Like globally, like it doesn't matter if they're not big here.
Mm. Maybe this is not where you were going, but I'm really okay with Asians having something for themselves, you know. I'm I'm really okay with there being some, like, it's exclusive for us because we haven't had that, you know. We haven't had music that we can celebrate and it feels like it's made by us for us. Um I think it's great. Like, why not have an Asian label that can celebrate our identity and our culture and the way we like engage in food and each other and community, and we all take our shoes off, and like that is how the label is represented and who it's for. It's for us, and it's exclusive, and it feels like, we can latch onto that. I love it. I want that to happen. Everyone should have a place where they feel like they can go to a festival and they belong.
I definitely agree. Like it's good to have, obviously our representation, right? Like as Asians as a whole, right? Like it feels great, right? It feels great to be like part of a larger community, probably to see people on stage. And, I do want to bring up, like for example, like the Kinjaz and Jabbawockeez, right? Right. Because they were some of the first early pioneers of, I would actually want to say like Asian American representation, right? And them breaking into like a more Asian oriented sort of media scene, right? Because usually there's not a lot of Asian Americans that make it big, right? Going the other way. A lot of times it's like they come over here, they come from East Asia, they come over here, right? And then that's when they start to, become big, or they're already bigger over there and then they come over here. So it doesn't necessarily go always both ways. So I think for the Kinjaz and Jabbawockeez, right? Like especially I'm sure in the dance community, like it probably even showed a path like, hey, these are people who maybe you grew up with on YouTube, you maybe saw them on, World of Dance or So You Think You Can Dance, and just to see Asian dancers being on a nationally televised American show is probably going to mean a lot to the community, so the Asian dance community.
Both of these groups have been hugely influential. I mean, I was in high school when Jabberwockies won America's Best Dance Crew, and and I was from San Diego, which is where they said they were from. A little history though on Jabberwockies, though. This is a group that actually stems from Sacramento, and then each of their members kind of went to different places, but they have roots across California, and we're not just choreography dancers. Like, these are people who participated in the street form scenes, and are individually amazing dancers in their own right. but yes, I mean, the Filipino American, Asian American dancers coming from these groups were huge for us. And a big reason why a lot of people continue to feed into the dance community from the Asian American community is because they see themselves in these folks. Um, I would be doing a disservice to the whole dance community, though, if I didn't mention a hot take, which is these are both all, or before at least as they started out, all male dance groups. And like many things, history repeats itself, and a, a dance community has been a very male dominated thing as well. And I have, yeah, maybe some hot takes around how some of these groups, Kinjaz, even Jabbawockeez, I think to a certain extent, have perpetuated this thing. And they've both tried really hard to also combat that. I think with feedback and accountability from the community. So yeah, I don't want to discount their influence at all and the good that they're doing, but just to call to light that there's always work to do.
Yeah, I think part of it is also, you also I think we can also think about it, it's like they've been friends for a really long time, right? Like I remember, I think it was like from Kinja's Mike Song, Anthony Lee, like they were actually, I think I had class with Mike Song one time. It was funny because it was an Asian American studies class, and I was in the lecture hall. I was sitting near the top of the lecture hall, and he was on the bottom in the front row, and he was wearing. I just remember he was wearing a purple shirt, a purple backpack, or something like that, and purple shoes. It was like clearly this guy looked like he was a dancer. But also just being able to see all the stuff that they've done, starting from their college times, right, to now professionally. It's so interesting just because you can I can see a lot of like where they came from, at least in terms of like their initial dance moves, or like even how they, you know the end result of their, or finished product of their choreo shows, right? Especially because I think Anthony was also in CADC, so just seeing like the movement of how everyone moves on stage, right? Like they have a very unique style, but that style has also been refined over a longer period of time. And of course, they've added to it too. But you could still, at least for me, like from a personal perspective, I could still see the fundamentals and origins of where their unique style kind of came from. So that's just something that I noticed. But you talked about community too, right? And that community, maybe for them was, this particular group of friends that wanted to continue dance and, to pioneer through it as a profession. And I think it's, the first step. You could say it's the first iteration, maybe them in the Jabbawockeez of, Asian representation. And I think maybe the next step, like you said, maybe is, the inclusion of, more women, or more, homage, right, to, the Black community, and where maybe they took their influences off of. But I would imagine also like they probably learned a lot of, their moves from different sources, whether it's from MTV, right, or from, being part of the initial dance community, right, like as well, to really get to them to the spot that they're at now.
Absolutely. And I want to credit Kinjaz. They've also opened up their membership, and Bailey Sock, right, is a really amazing and well-known female dancer who's killing the scene right now. Kind of the star uh, dancer, or kind of pair to Jackson Wang's recent music video. Apple, amazing dancer from China, also kind of inducted into Kinjaz. Um, and logistics, was kind of a Red Bull champion, amazing B girl. Like there are people in Kinjaz now who are not just men, and they've expanded. So props to Kinjaz, and we see movement. I just think there's a awareness of their influence and their ability to impact the community, and I just want to continue to see them do more of that.
Yeah, usually when I like, especially when I saw them at the head in the clouds this year. I was like, I definitely made sure I wanted to stay on near the stage to see them, just because a lot of them went to UCI, and I had seen them in person. So just being able to support alumni was kind of a nice thing, just because like they're seeing them online and then they're seeing them in person, but then there's also like, oh yeah, I saw you in person before you were the Kinjaz kind of thing. So I think that was a really cool experience to kind of see all of that. Just actually have a personal connection, kind of maybe similar to the way that you have a different connection with these dancers just by being in the dance community. Like,
Yeah. I wonder, Mike, have you played out the kind of multiverse situation where you did end up getting into a dance team and you maybe like being on the Kinjaz in current day?
that's kind of a stretch. I don't think I've ever thought about that. Although I will say, my mom used to say I was really into dance without any sort of like formal training, just like typical, like when you're 5 or 6 years old, you hear a dance tune, you get on the floor, you move your body, kind of thing. I'm sure she has. I know she has like embarrassing stories of me as a kid, just pretending that I knew I could actually dance, and I'm pretty sure I did do all that stuff. I think the motivation could have been there. I kind of just chose not really to embrace it, and maybe I just kind of skipped out on it in too many phases of my life, right? Like just not choosing to actually go down that path. And then I think as I saw like, oh, how difficult it actually could be, and then as you get older, the commitment and level of skill that if you wanted to be on a dance team, right, kind of thing, it gets that dream starts to be much more elusive.
I'll say if you have any interest in wanting to continue that or go back into it, it is always here for you.
You are a good teacher, I will say that.
Thank you, and I'd be happy to teach, but I also think that I don't know. There's so many tools now where you can learn dance on your own. The safety and kind of comfort of not having to be in front of other people. If that's something that is hindering you or others out there who might be listening, but
I think it's more of when you watch something online, right? You're kind of just you're mimicking the movements, but I still think you have to have some base level of fundamentals, right? To really understand the root of it. Or it's like I have to learn myself, right? And really appreciate like, you know, uh for example, I don't know, I'm just using an example like there's a 6 count or there's an 8 count, right? Or there's like basic music terms, right? And language that I think would be very helpful in terms of just having a better fundamental understanding. Otherwise it's just going to be me like, yeah, I could learn and sync dance, right? But would I really know the substance kind of behind it? Like that's the thing where it's just like you learn one thing on the internet, but then how do you put it together uh, beyond just that?
I mean, I think it starts from finding a teacher who can do that for you. If you're in Southern Cal, I'll say this. As an advanced dancer who's been dancing for a while, I still go to take beginner classes. Part of the reason is because my friends are teaching these classes and it's nice to support friends when they're teaching. The other is I still need it. I still need to be reminded of the building blocks of what I do in an advanced class. And a beginner class can still be challenging for me. It still is. I took one last week and I had a great time, but there were things that I needed to work on, and I still used the same amount of attention and physical commitment that I would in an advanced class. It just wasn't as many moves, but still, I'm like trying my hardest, and it's can still be challenging, but it's helpful to remind myself of these things. So it's I don't know. I think I'd also say that beginner classes or classes that are geared towards people who are just starting out, um it's not just for them, it's for all, and I think you're right, it does create require like fundamentals, but those fundamentals can be built. And really that is where it should start. Mike, I would not encourage you to just jump into an advanced dance class and that would be your pursuit of doing it.
Yeah, that's like asking for like frustration and just overall it's like trying to switch. You're basically, if I did that, I'm asking to drown, right? Like from a dance perspective, for probably a good half hour, hour, however long that session's going to be. Got to stay in the kiddie pool first.
Yeah, exactly. It's and so like there are online dance platforms now that offer beginner classes. Steezy is a kind of well-known one that has built a really, actually, I think a really great product for dancers of all different levels to learn beginner to intermediate to advanced to specific forms of hip hop to even workout classes that can kind of help you build the just the physical stamina or the vocabulary to take on more strenuous physical activity or more strenuous physically demanding choreography. And a bunch of studios over the pandemic have come up with their own online dance platforms, or even choreographers have kind of secured a platform for them to share their own, specifically their choreography. So I think the pandemic has had many benefits in the world, despite it also being extremely oppressive and restrictive. But I think in some ways it has kind of democratized dance, and I found that cool. Now there are some ugly things about it, but in general, access to dance I think it's greater than it's ever been.
Yeah, I still think that there's still an element that's missing by not having, like, if you were just to rely solely on digital media and social media just for dance, there's still something missing from, or there's still something to be said about having a live community, right? Being able to dance with other people. And you talked about sharing vulnerability, right? And emotional connectivity and having that community like in IRL, right? Like I feel like that emotion and that feeling is probably something that's really difficult to replicate online, or if you can, right? Or if it's able to, it's not the same, right? It's not the same as being able, to be next to someone, to see the space that they're taking up, right? Or lack of space that they're taking up. um, I just still think that like it probably just needs to complement each other, right? You still need that physical in-person community to really just enhance and make it feel real, I think, to a certain degree.
You're so right. There is no substitute for it. I mean, I may be going to bat for online dance platforms, but I'm probably a in the minority of users. Like I take class weekly, and I have rehearsal once a week. I prefer the in person above any kind of digital dancing for sure. And I know people who just don't do it at all because that's not how they want to engage with dance.
Cool. I do want to move on to the Filipino American experience. Um, I want to ask, yeah, have you seen? I know it's been like 2 or 3 months since it's come out, but have you seen Easter Sunday by Jokoy?
Are you waiting for my take, Mike?
I mean, what are your thoughts? Like, I'm not Filipino, so like, I can give you my thoughts. And so, funny thing too is like, my girlfriend, she's Filipino, so I also asked for her thoughts and her friends' thoughts as well because we saw it all together. It was something, and of all places, we saw it in Union City, which is also super like a very Filipino esque, like a very Filipino, predominantly Filipino area. I think it's also um, Latino, as well as Indian as well. But yeah, it was a good experience. I think she enjoyed it more than I did. But I want to get your take on it first and your thoughts.
Yeah. I want to give it up to Jokoy for creating a film that was intended to be for Filipinos. I'm using my language very intentionally here. I didn't think it was a great film. It wasn't an it did not hit it out of the park for me. But I also want to normalize that it's okay to have mediocre movies. That not everything out of the Asian community has to be spectacular and exceptional. Because let's be real, there are mediocre movies in every other genre and from white people all the time. Did I want it to be a home run movie? 100%. Like, I don't know. I lived in the Bay Area for like 11 years. I wanted the characters to be more Bay. Like, I wanted there to be, I wanted the kind of like the love interest of Jokoy's son to be.
Well, you want it to be more Bay Area? Because I felt like it was already very, well, Bay Area to begin with, and I felt like it was the opposite, right? Like, or if it should have been the opposite. Like, I get like his son was in LA and, it was focused up here in Daly City. They mentioned ceremony, right, as well. And it was just like, I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit, maybe because it was and I get it, it was so specific, but it felt like it was to a very specific Bay Area or a specific Filipino audience. Let's say, there are other Filipino communities other than just the Bay Area, right? Like there's LA, I believe they're also in like New Jersey and New Orleans, and it kind of excludes them a little bit. It's like it kind of made the Filipino American experience centered around Daly City. Like it just kind of said like everywhere else doesn't really exist. But it also assumes that every Filipino person in America knows where Daly City and Saramonte is.
I say I wanted it more Bay because I felt like it didn't bring the nuance of Daly City that I think would have brought out actually a more universal and more relatable Filipino experience that could be similar to that of New Jersey or of San Diego or of LA. Um, but I don't think you got that. Like, hip hop is a big thing within the Filipino community. Filipinos, there were some really like prominent DJs that helped bring forth uh, the black art form of music into the California scene. And I actually don't know if that was well represented, or I didn't feel that was well represented in Easter Sunday. And many Filipinos from Daly City are very much people who are hip hop heads and kind of live in that and embody that. But the way that some of the characters were portrayed, it didn't feel like that was part of the story of Easter Sunday. Yet that is really kind of the identity of a lot of people who are identify as Filipino and are in Daly City. And I would say that that kind of embodiment of hip hop and the way that they and how it's integrated into their music and their culture and their friend groups is a more kind of universal or relatable experience across those cities that you mentioned. There are parts of Daly City in culture, but also in like geography and how people navigate the space that feel much like the Filipino part of where I grew up in San Diego. And so when I've spent time in Daly City, it feels like I'm in National City in San Diego. Or when I was just in Queens a couple weeks ago, and there are parts of Queens that feel like Daly City. And like when I walked into a Jollibee in Queens or in Woodside, which is Queens, it's like the experience was no different than if I was in Daly City or if I was in Chula Vista. So yeah, but it some of the nuance of that. I wanted the girlfriend of Jokoy's son to be more Bay Area, more like hip hop, and not that she wasn't a cool character, she was, but there were just, I think there were few nuances, but opportunity to include more that would make it feel more authentic and relatable, I think.
Do you think Jokoy, well, primarily was just focusing a lot on the family kind of element? Like I feel like that was like kind of the central message of the show, or not show. I was saying show because I literally thought of it more as like Fresh Off the Boat, but for 2 hours, right? Like that's it was more like a sitcom for 2 hours. And like you said, not every movie has to be a movie. It could also just be a really long sitcom. And if you frame it in that way, I think it did the job. But going back to family, everything was like family dynamic, and I felt like that was the focus of it for the most part. Like the relationship between him and his mom, the aunties, like fighting, with each other, and obviously they had older Filipino representation as well. Like they paid homage to like the people that were in the or prominent celebrities, that were Filipino, or not that sorry, not more Filipino, that didn't necessarily get highlighted or represented and have their huge light in the sun. And he kind of brought them all together to pay homage to them on state on set.
I thought some of the family dynamics were portrayed really well. I really enjoyed Jokoy's mom, her performance in the movie, just spot on. How Atita would operate. I think that the drama between the Titas was pretty good. It was dramatic, but what do you expect out of it?
Yeah, but it's a comedy, right? Like that's his job, right? To blow it out of proportion.
Right, right. I think that was accomplished. And there, yeah, I'm not. I didn't hate the movie. Yeah, don't please like don't get me wrong. I'm glad it exists.
You don't want to get canceled by other Filipinos, so I understand.
I mean, here's the chismis, which means like gossip in Tagalog, or yeah, well, Filipino really. There's a difference. Look it up. Yeah, it's it wasn't perfect, and no way it was going to be perfect. But I just it was very Filipino, but it also felt like a caricature of being Filipino. And I think that's what was the biggest disappointment for me. Um, I walked away feeling like, is this what people are going to think of Filipinos after watching this movie? Because these things are true, but they're not. It's not capturing like the nuances of my identity. It's not just that we're loud and we're dramatic, like, or that we make a big deal about food. I don't know. It's hard for me to find some of the words around it. Maybe I need to watch it again to be more informed. But I watched it once and I felt like that was enough. But like even Jokoy not taking off his shoes when he got into the house, that pissed me off. Like what kind of house is this? He didn't take off his shoes.
But also, do you think it's more well, maybe in that one scene, right, where he doesn't take off his shoes, maybe that's a symbolism of him becoming more Americanized, where he doesn't necessarily, care about the roots as much, right? Or maybe just the instance where he's just so preoccupied with, becoming, a professional comedian that sometimes he forgets his family, right? Like we're just like just not in that space. But the other thing that I wanted to also comment on was maybe this was really meant for Filipino. I mean, first and foremost, probably for a Filipino audience, right? So it's meant to be, I think, maybe self-deprecating, right? And it's also because it's made by a comedian, right? So I think it's also the context in which it was made, right, as well. So I think there's some elements to that where it was more about representation for the Filipino community more so than anything on the big screen, right? It's more of that cultural moment as a sitcom, just on a movie format. And then secondarily, it's, for other people. But first and foremost, I think it was for largely a Filipino audience.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. Let us not discount what this has done for the Filipino community. They're on the big screen, and it's in your face about it, right? Like this is not just Alea Salonga being the voice of Mulan, and us settling for, oh, but it's an Asian voice who is for an Asian character. Like These are Filipinos playing Filipinos about a Filipino story in a very Filipino part of the Bay Area. Like, let's get it. And that should be celebrated 100%. I'm about it. Like, hey, my food was on screen, you know?
I can see your other point too. I understand like how the perception of how it could be seen, and it's just hard to have it both ways, right? Like one, it probably doesn't help that it's from a comedic angle, right? So if it makes Filipinos laugh, right, it's going to be taken one way. It may not be seen the same way if you're not Filipino. Like there are certain things that, like, for example, the box of stuff that they send back to the Philippines, right? Like, I wasn't as familiar with that, but for my girlfriend and her friends, right, like that was something very personal, right? It was funny for them, right? And they're probably seeing it over the top, but they're also seeing the truth and irony, I think, behind it. So I think it's just a matter of how you absorb the comedy, I guess, and from what perspective you're absorbing it. I think that's how those perspectives could differ.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably coming across way more critical than I want to be. Yeah, I am. I I don't know any like explicitly Filipino movie, Mike, that I've 100% enjoyed, and I think it's just because I'm harder on it. Like and I could lighten up. Yeah, it it I I think what I want to do is be able to hold all of it in tension, right? Like I can enjoy and appreciate and celebrate the representation of my people in this movie, and I can be critical of it. Like both can be true and exist at the same time, and that's what will keep us moving forward.
Look, that's how I felt about Crazy Rich Asians. I felt that way about Crazy Rich Asians, like as well. I thought it was like, so my ex girlfriend at the time, she really loved it, and I was just like, it's an okay movie. It's like it's cool to see have representation. She got really mad at me. It's like, how dare you ruin my moment, right? Like, don't speak slander against this movie. But story wise, like, yeah, it's a rom com. It There's some parts where you kind of have to just let it go, right? And the story is going to take off to where it's going to take off. Like, but it was nice. Like, yeah, you can criticize. I have my thoughts about the movie, but it was just nice to see representation at the same time. So opposing opposites, right, or conflicting views can also be true at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I'd probably watch it again on some streaming service.
I don't know what streaming service is going to come out. I haven't heard any news about it. I hope it does come out on a streaming service. To be quite honest, like that's probably the best form of distribution now that, like, most, I would assume, Filipinos went to the movies to go see it, and then it's something that can easily be accessed again.
For the record, I went with 9 of my family members. So we rolled deep.
Did they enjoy it first and foremost?
They did. So I went with, let's see who it was. Me, my brother, my dad, my grandmother, her sister, um, my aunt and her husband. Oh gosh, who else? My grandma's brother and his wife. And they're all obviously older generation. They really enjoyed it and laughed, and it was an experience, a Filipino experience itself by going to the movies with them. Right, like they don't go to the movies that often. They're like,
I feel like that just mirrored the exact part of the movie, right? Like, because the movie is just like a big family kind of getting together, and literally it was just that, like, the cultural moment was really brought to life. Uh, so I think that's pretty amazing. I've heard, like, and feel free, like, I'm just curious, like, what does the older Filipino generation just generally think about Jokoy? Because he's obviously kind of one of, like, the currently, right, probably one of the more prominent Filipino entertainers, right, or person in entertainment, right, that's visible right now, right? Like, is it something where they really like him? Like, do they see him, like, as, like, does the older generation Do they see him as like, oh, that's like my younger son, right? Kind of feeling, right? Like kind of national treasure. Is I'm just curious how different generations sort of view him. Just because he's a guy in his 50s, I believe, and so he's quite a bit old, a little bit older than we are, and so I'm just thinking like generation wise, like there may be either. I'm just curious how they view him, right? Just because we have one view of him, or maybe you have one view of him, but then your grandma or grandparents or parents have a different view of him.
Yeah, I will. Well, thank you for couching it that way. I do not speak on behalf of all Filipinos, but I do have data from within my family, and that is data from different aunts, or we call them titas, my dad, different people. It's a mixed bag. I think I've heard titas be like, "Oh, I don't think he's that funny, but I like him because he's Filipino." Like because he represents Filipinos in the community. They have all of the pride in the world. If it was like, if there was a hill to die on about like which celebrities they want, oh, Jokoy because he's Filipino. But if it was like, oh, like who has and yeah, like who has the best jokes, they might choose Jokoy just because he's Filipino. But I've heard the same aunt say, but I don't think he's that funny. Like he's just making fun of us. And like, is there not something more original that he could do? Um, so I agree with that take too. It's like, could you be a little bit more innovative with your and I haven't yet watched his latest special, which I heard was pretty good and better than Easter Sunday. But and then I think there are some that don't listen to him at all because they just know that they're not the audience, that they don't have the like Filipino American experience. So I think it's across the board. My dad, when he watched Easter Sunday, he was like, the funniest part of that movie to me was when Jokoy took the stage at church and basically did a stand-up set. And so you know what I mean? Like I think it's mixed reviews all over. I think Filipinos are just happy to see another Filipino on screen. And that is fine. That is something that Jokoy should celebrate, that the community should celebrate. My grandma, who is a woman of few words, found it very funny and liked it and enjoyed the experience. But I don't think she takes much pride in like having watched the movie or knowing that Jokoy is Filipino. She just was amused. So yeah.
Mm. Do you think, going back to your like aunties, saying like, oh, he's the hill that I will die on, right? If But his jokes aren't funny. Do you think part of it is also kind of like a status community thing, right? It's like he's someone you can talk about with other people, right? And he's well known enough that you can kind of just hang your head on, or hang your hat on, and just say like, hey, like, you know just to stay within the community, or hold a certain status of like, hey, I'm proud to be Filipino, I'm proud of Jokoy, right? It's like he's just more of that kind of conversation, even though personally they don't think like, oh, he's not funny. Like maybe there's a duality like to that.
That's 100%. I mean, let's rewind to the days of Manny Pacquiao, right? Like boxing and Manny Pacquiao being on like the international stage. Filipinos are so proud of Manny Pacquiao. So when we get someone who's on the international stage like Jokoy, of course, it is about a status thing. It's about bringing it up at the hospital that you work at and be like, "Oh my god, did you watch the Jokoy movie?" Like they're so into it because it's something that they can talk about and it represents like who they are. There's a solidarity. There's a identity. There's a community behind it. So it is 100% that, Mike. And you can't fault them for it. Like, let them enjoy it. Let them have that moment, the same thing happened with Jasmine Trias when she was on American Idol years ago. Any kind of Filipino that makes it into the media and kind of can bring a name people will be proud of it. I mean, you have Sweetie, right? Hip hop artist. She's half black, half Filipino. Big talks about her. Of course, her, right? from the Bay Area, half Filipino, half Black.
I do have a story about that. I think we're about to watch Easter Sunday, maybe like the week after it came out, or maybe it was the same weekend, I can't remember. And then one of my girlfriend's friends, she was like, "Did you see Sweetie's like story, right? Like, she's at Seafood City. It's definitely the one, right? Like in some location." And then I my smart ass just says like, "Are you sure it's today?" Like the story looks kind of overcast. I think it was overcast like 2 days ago, so this is probably a late post. She's like, "Damn it, it's probably right," because like the movie outside it was like really sunny, and so I might have dashed some dreams of you know meeting her or just getting people excited to meet her. But yeah, like that's just my funny story of connecting the two stories. But yeah, go on. So you were saying, yeah, I know she's
And it's cool to see the like them in media, right? And like killing it, and getting attention. That's exciting for us because Filipinos not really on the map. And it's nice to be on the map.
I do want to talk about this one thing that kind of popped up maybe like, I don't know, 3 months ago. Maybe right before Jokoy. I don't know if you heard about what was it, like people using Filipinx instead of Filipino. Um, well, first of all, did you hear about that? Like kind of nuance in terms of the conversation of language and how it's used.
Um, I'm definitely familiar. I think I've heard it before. I've used the term myself. In my job, I was also kind of helping plan the Filipino American History Month events, and there was a big discussion around if we should use Filipinx or Filipinx versus Filipino. So yeah, it's I think it's an interesting topic. Um, how I've engaged.
Version of it, just so the viewers kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. I think there was a movement where people were trying to use Filipinx, right, to be more, gender inclusive. My understanding is that like it was kind of taking what was applied to Latino and Latina and applying Latinx, right, but applying that same kind of logic to Filipino or to Filipino, Filipina, right, and just saying Filipinx. But there was apparently like Filipino in its origin is gender, I believe, gender neutral, and so there was kind of a discussion on whether it should be referred to as Filipinx or just Filipino. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not Filipino, but that's what I've read in terms of the backstory behind it.
You got it right, Mike. And I'd say that bringing up the kind of treatment of Latino or Latina to Latinx is, I think, the right way to go too. And to just kind of cover the bases there. Even that is in kind of contention, right? Where there are some people who are like, why are we using an X in Latinx? This just feels like, again, another kind of uh, Eurocentric or white-centric way of trying to identify people who are either of the Latin identity by using a Western way to do it. Why can't we use something that feels more like within the cultural context? So there are some people who opt for Latine versus Latinx, and that and I think to now consider what is it for Filipinos and Filipinx versus Filipino and Filipina. I mean, it is gender neutral when we consider the pronouns within Tagalog or Filipino. Siya is used as the pronoun. There is no he or her, which is why if you're Filipino and listening to this or understand some Tagalog or hear it, Filipinos of an older generation often get mixed up between he and her or him and hers because you do not have to change the pronoun when you're speaking in the language. And so having to do that within English takes some mental energy and code switching, really. Now to do then like Filipina and Filipino, well, I don't know actually the history of this. My best guess is the introduction of the Spanish gendering, and when Spain conquered the Philippines, this is where the kind of this distinction has come from. But Filipino itself, for many Filipinos who either live in the diaspora or within the Philippines, this is how they identify. So Filipinx feels like a disruption or a departure from what actually feels authentic for them, which is I am Filipino, whether I identify as a woman or a man or trans or however, Filipino does encompass my identity. I think where I stand on this is allow the individual to identify it for themselves, but don't impose what you think the label should be. And this gets tricky because Filipinx is like, in my case, I'm using it to label an entire month for the purposes of celebrating it at the company that I work at. But does that mean if I use it that it can't be Filipino or it can't be Filipina? And it started some healthy dialogue, I think. But this is where I think we have to be able to engage with that conversation and respect what an individual might want, and for them to entertain and accept their dissent about it. Um, I don't have a particular stance on it. I think when I talk about it, I say both, and I offer it as offerings for the language. When I talk about, when I talk about Filipino stuff, depending on my audience, I might be like Filipino or Filipinx, and I'll share both as options, so that I acknowledge that there's maybe some people who identify with one label or the other, and it also just opens the conversation and allows for some education.
I think that's a very inclusive approach, right? That the intent behind that is showing consideration, right, for potentially joining viewpoints, right? Because like essentially they could be opposing viewpoints, but by acknowledging both, right, it's also validating. Let's say like we acknowledge that these are two viewpoints that can coexist, together. And I wonder if like because Filipinx is probably a newer term, right? To use to try to be more broadly inclusive. I almost feel, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have a differing viewpoint, it's almost like it's a label to almost like it's a sociological label, right? It's like how do you define like not an era, right? But just like a broad term. But then, a broad term versus what's used personally, right? Or how you identify personally. I still think that's up to the person, like you said. So I wonder if it's just more of like it's a broad term to almost generically label because someone needs, right, to be able to describe a certain set of feelings or a status or a condition of a person, right, that maybe wasn't necessarily represented in both words. And there's probably arguments you said like it doesn't need to be, but maybe there are some people that feel like uh, there just isn't that one word, right, to really describe a broader phenomenon, with a kind of introduction of a new word. So that's kind of where I can sort of see where the origins are coming from. But yeah, just that was just my take like on it.
I agree with your take. It's this generation's attempt at making sense of what they have, right? I think language will always be imperfect, and it's trying things out.
I mean, language changes over time, right? Like you look at TikTok, right? Like, God, new words come up all the time. New language comes up all the time. Changes every 2 weeks, maybe a week if we're lucky. Uh, I know I'm joking around, but I'm also like half serious about it as well. Just as a millennial, trying to just keep up with Gen Z language and lingo. I think yeah, like language changes, and you know, like you mentioned, I think you might have mentioned before, right? Like words and terms that exist now for a new generation, for, you know, more representation and, you know, stuff with good intent, right? You take that to your grandparents or whoever, they may have no concept of it whatsoever. And it, a language sometimes becomes generational, like at that point.
Right. Yep. It, and we have to make space for it all.
It's part of being inclusive.
Sometimes you have to draw the line. I mean, I I remember my great grandmother, when she was still alive, was using words to describe Black people in ways that I would never do. Um, it's like, is this inclusive to not correct her? um, yeah, I think my response then is lean into creating awareness and sharing rather than correcting. Um,
Because someone has to correct on their own, right? Like you can't force someone. I mean, you can encourage them to correct, right? And you can educate, but you know, they have to make, you know, the decision on their own. I think part of it's also like maybe they're in an environment where it's a self echo chamber, right? Like, you know, it, especially for more collective communities, it's harder to break through. They have a different set of, you know, conditions that they've grown up in, different kind of education that's very well rooted, right? And hard to, you know, to change. And I think that's the hardest part, right? Is really I'm trying to understand and speak the language, right, of and thoughts of your elders, right? Like I just imagine that, you know, older Asian people care about status a lot. Like we all, everyone cares about status in a certain level, but for, I feel like for Asians, like that's how they rank themselves, right? Like less about moral good, you know, generally it's like, how does this benefit me within the context of the group, right? Kind of thing. And how to communicate through that and use language that they'll understand is, I think that's the hard part to crack, right? Because for millennials and boomers, right? Like we may use different languages or ideologies might be different. And I think there hasn't really been a good way to communicate in styles that um, resonate with each other's groups, which I think causes a lot of tension, right? Overall, like uh, I was watching this show, or I was watching this interview with Bowen Yang and Yul Kwan. So Bowen Yang, obviously Asian comedian. Yul Kwan, I think winner on Survivor. I think it was like season 3 or something like that. And he was saying how his parents wouldn't acknowledge that he was a Survivor winner. It didn't matter, right? Like even though he won $1 million, you know, he was on TV. He had his time to shine. Didn't matter, right? But when he was written in his local Korean newspaper that he was a winner, then his parents had something to brag about, right? And that's when they acknowledged it, right? So it's really about meeting parents, I think, at the local level of, you know, having status among their friends, right? Or, you know, kind of how we were saying, we talk about Jokoy, right? Like they don't think he's funny, but he's my, you know, he's the hero, right? Like that you're gonna hang your hat on, right? If all else fails. So it's really about communication styles, I think, at the end of the day, when communicating between generations.
what's hard is that I agree. Why cannot that uh, I want I so badly want these generations to be able to expand what they care about.
It's hard, right? Because it's so community rooted, right? Like another example I'll use, um, weddings, perfect example, right? Um, Oftentimes, depending on your family's generation, right? Sometimes they'll be more heavy-handed at weddings, right? They'll say like, you need to have XYZ, right? You need to have this, you need to have that, you need to invite this person. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's for the couple's benefit?
No.
Yeah, whose benefit it's for. It's really just so the parents can show off to other parents, right? To show that like they have status, right? Like that, or not they have status, but like that they're putting on a show, right? Like they're putting on like we can provide, right? It's a game of song and dance, and that's something that's really important in that's embedded in the culture, right? For some generations, um, and it's a communication style. Like with me and my girlfriend, um, we've talked about like, hey, like, so my family, like, they're not really embedded with like, hey, you have to have a Chinese wedding or anything like that. But I talk with my girlfriend, I'm like, I already know there's going to be certain things that she's going to want, well, that her mom's going to want, right? And I'm probably going to have to abide by it, right? Because you know, is she willing to risk her reputation and her relationship with her mom, her aunties, or uncles over this, right? And like sometimes you kind of have to cater to it a little bit. Not saying that you can't, right? And you don't have to, but there realistically potentially could be consequences, like consequences of maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but maybe disownment or families having a grudge because you made them look bad because there wasn't certain elements that uh, weren't there, right? Maybe in a wedding, right? That made them look worse in front of other people. So I think there's like that element of balancing out the reality versus idealism, and especially in a lot of like Asian movies, Asian American movies, I have noticed that the parents sometimes do say "I love you," right? Or the grandparents say "I love you." But when I ask like other people, it's like, if you had your grandparents watch that, do you think they'll say "I love you"? They're just like, no. It's just like a lot of it. It's ideal, right? It's idealism versus reality, and that's either what makes a good story, um, but yeah, that's something I kind of been thinking about. I talk about it with my girlfriend sometimes, and we talk about the differences between you know the what we want as millennials, because a lot of these media stories, they're not meant for our grandparents, right? Crazy Rich Asians isn't meant for our grandparents necessarily, like to change their ideals. It's really a reflection of what we wish that we kind of have, but it also identifies with the struggles that we have by putting the grandparents, like the best and worst qualities, right, as the characters, but also what we idealize kind of sometimes our grandparents, what we want them to be as well.
I have so many thoughts right now.
But yeah, that was my take.
Yeah, oh, man. Many thoughts on weddings. I appreciate your take, and I think it's humbling for me to hear that that's just part of your calculus of, well, what things will I be able to negotiate, and what is it that that you have to abide by. When I think about my proverbial wedding in the future, I actually very much am about kind of this collectivist perspective. That a wedding is not all about me and the bride. It is absolutely about the family. And I think it can be seen from the perspective of, like people got to save face, and this is about protecting and communicating one's status. But I also see it from the perspective of honoring the people who you have invited and who have helped raise you and get you to where you are now. Um, I have experienced weddings where I have been quite disappointed in how they have not kind of considered the family aspect of it, and it's been I don't know, it has kind of weighed heavy on me. And that's just how I see family gatherings, as it is not about any one or two particular people. There's a reason why people are invited, and it's because we take care of each other. Um, and so I think it's just a part of the whole of it.
It's because of the money, right? Like I hear in back channels, right? Like, oh, invite this person, they're rich, right? Invite this person, right? They'll give you more money, right, for your wedding, right? Like it also becomes like this, strategic economic element as well. Not to derail from like, honoring family and stuff like that. But there is also kind of the family politics and strategizing, behind it.
100%.
One thing I was thinking about recently was, I don't know, have you seen Encanto?
I have, yes.
I recently just saw it. I recently just saw it, and it really made, because the whole story is about family, right? And there's obviously intergenerational trauma. There's a relationship between the abuela and Maribel and the rest of her family. And the interesting thing that got me thinking about family was that it's both supportive and constrictive, right? At the same time. Like it can be both. And I think it's really about managing both sides of it. Like, and especially because we live in America, I think that also adds another complexity to it. And I was talking about this with my girlfriend recently too, which was, here in America, you can be individualistic, right? Like if you wanted to discard your family, not discard your family, but if you wanted to like be your own person and you wanted to survive on your own and, have an estranged relationship with your family in order to do what you want to do, right? Like, you can do it, right? Like it's part of being an individualistic culture. Um, but like, let's say if this same person, grew up, I don't know, let's just say in the Philippines, for example, you're not in a culture that would encourage that, right? Like, because you would still need your family for a lot of things. And I think it's so interesting, as Asian Americans, that we live in this duality of almost opposing ideals. And sometimes it's hard to find that common ground for people of different generations to understand each other, just from those viewpoints.
I appreciate that perspective.
Anyways, I do want to start to wrap it up. I know we had quite a long interview. I do want to ask if you have any advice for young people.
Talk to the old folks. And by old, I don't mean just like people who are a few years older than you, but listen to the stories of people who are significantly older than you, your grandparents, your great grandparents, if you have access to them. Or if you don't have your grandparents around, spend time with older people. Maybe I just have an affinity to people who are senior citizens, but I love hearing stories, and some of the best advice and stories and lessons learned have come from people who have just lived more life. And I think it is such a gift to have people who have been around here longer to just share their experiences. They've seen a lot and they've gone through a lot, and so they have a lot of wisdom to share and a perspective that we don't get to hear often because media and social life as we know it as young people does not really make space for older folks. So I think it's a perspective that is often unique amongst young people because we just don't make a lot of space for older folks. So talk to them, make time. Maybe it's volunteering. Maybe it's just calling your grandparents. For me, it's also a chance to practice language. I was not raised speaking Tagalog or Filipino. I picked it up by watching the Filipino channel and spending time with my grandparents. And when I'm with my grandma, I'd say we speak maybe 70% in Tagalog and 30% in English. And as someone who loves languages and just wants to engage with my grandma more, it's great. And so yeah, I'd say go talk to the older generations, y'all. Your older self will thank you.
I definitely agree with that. I think especially like in your early 20s and 30s, it's really easy to be stuck in Instagram, TikTok bubble. Because all the content is very curated, towards your was your likes, right? Your interests, and sometimes you need a different perspective. And I think it is important to have friends in different age groups. And oftentimes, if you hear the same kind of advice from different age groups, like whether it's like your grandparents, people that are a little bit younger than your parents, and maybe even your parents to a certain perspective, like you start to hear common threads, right, across different age groups that maybe wouldn't be necessarily accepted, in your 20 or 30-year-old like age group. So I think that's something that's really important as well. I also just wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just one more thing is I don't know. I kind of have a informal board of directors for my life, like trusted individuals, friends that, yeah, I turn to for kind of counsel or advice, or when I'm at like big inflection points, I consider them or consult them. And there are varying ages. There are aunts that I consult. There are people of my age. There are younger folks, and it's just helpful to have the differing perspectives to inform you and to guide you. So plus one on that, Mike. Yeah.
A much more lighthearted question is, if you were to make your professional debut as a dancer, who would you want to be the backup dancer to?
Man. That's a tough one.
If it's tough, I know that you have thought about it, right, at some point, but you just probably can't decide, between multiple people.
Right now I'm just trying to think about like whose music do I want to get down to on stage? Like who would be awesome to move to? Um Maybe it's just because I've seen clips recently of Usher's performance or his residency that he has in Vegas. Yeah, a stage dancer, backup dancer for Usher would be pretty sick. Um, is that who I want to say is my answer?
You only get one. You only get one.
Mike, let's go with Usher then. Yeah,
That's a pretty good answer. I mean, I'm glad he's still relevant, right? Whether even if it's a residency at Vegas, like I'm just glad we get to we get to see him, right? People can actually go visit his concerts for people who weren't able to go. And also just like I think him going on the Tiny Desk tour, and doing his spot there, I think that really helped bring him back to relevancy again. On top of going to Vegas, watch this exactly. So um, I think it was really good for him. And yeah, I do want to eventually want to go see him in Vegas for his residency.
well, I think I don't know how long it's going, but my friends and I were talking about going in like early spring, March of next year.
Okay, if you had a 1B.
1B also has a residency in Vegas, and it is Silk Sonic. Um,
Okay, Anderson Pack and Bruno Mars.
Anderson Paak, Bruno Mars, some Filipino representation in there as well. Gosh, their music is obviously very nostalgic, but very modern and for today, and so danceable. Uh,
Do you know how tall Bruno Mars is?
isn't he just above 5 feet?
I think so. The funny thing is, like, whenever they film his music videos, they always film from a lower diagonal angle, and that's to make him look taller. I always find that so interesting from like a cinematic or cinematography perspective. It's just
Mm-hmm. Hey, his presence make him seem really tall. So Bruno, whatever you're doing, you're killing it, my friend. My friend, like we're friends. We're not friends.
all right. Christian, if people want to know more, about you, about your the dance groups that you're with, um, and anything else, API or being more inclusive oriented, where can they find you?
I'm really only on Instagram, at it's crod. That's ITS_CROD. I post dance content and sometimes stuff on my story. I'd say right now, y'all, I'm for my mental, I'm not really on it. But that's mostly where I am on the social. So catch me there. If you do want to follow me, yeah. Feel free. I think I think I'm public still. So if you want to watch my dance stuff or just go through my highlights, you are more than welcome. And yeah, shoot me a message. I'm down to chat, engage.
Cool. Well, Christian, I wanted to thank you for coming on to this podcast. I know it's been quite a long one, but I really appreciate you having you on here, talking about all things dance, diversity, equity, inclusion, about the music scene and your experience as a Filipino American. It was a great talk, in my opinion, and I appreciate you being on this podcast.
Mike, as always, have appreciated your intentionality and yeah, ability to navigate a conversation that allows at least me to feel like I can share authentically and openly. So thanks for the opportunity. And if there's another round to do it, you can count me in.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Christian. See you later.